Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. It's about 12 p.m. where I'm at. 12. The date is December 15th, 2024, and we are finishing our reading of Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson III. This will be the final part of this seventh book in our Book to React series. Go check out the other books that we've read on this channel. I have some ideas what I want to do in 2025, where I do more formal book reviews, as in I write out the description of every chapter, my takes on every chapter, and the overall summary of the ideas, because I feel like that might be a better way to get across some of my interpretations of this book, of these books that we'll be reading on this channel. And also go check out the movie reviews that I do with my wife, Acti. We got one coming later today for the movie Love Jones. And then we'll also be doing Ghost in the Shell as well. And yeah, sorry for anybody who's a big fan of mine who has felt like I've been absent or gone or missing. You know, I've been studying, working, and generally just trying to stay fit, going to the gym and stuff like that. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't been uploading as much, but I'm going to continue to try to, uplift my community, continue to educate myself and educate the public and the masses, and continue to just be involved and active for as long as God gives me a voice. So yeah, this book, Afro-Pessimism, has been one of the most interesting books that I've read this year. And I can generally say that I loved it. I enjoyed it. This has been a wild journey. Frank B. Wilderson is an amazing writer. And a lot of his experiences reflect a lot of my experiences in my life as well. And it's always refreshing to hear people's stories and feel like you're not alone. And that's what this book did for me. While I do have some debates in my mind about how I feel about Afro-pessimism as a meta theory or a framework for understanding Black life in this white supremacist world, I do think there are many cogent arguments and many important points that he brings up when discussing the troubles and issues that affect Black people at a granular level. So very impressive book, and I'm looking forward to reading the final chapter in the epilogue. And if you have a book that you want me to read or review, put it in the comments. I'll try to get to that. Same thing for the movies as well. There's a lot of stuff happening on this channel. I've just been caught up and busy and frankly a bit of a procrastinator to do everything that I want to do for this channel. But yeah, this is Afro-Pessimism. The book is right here. You can pick it up on Amazon for the humble price of only, what is it today? $21.95 hardcover and $11.66 paperback. So let's go to chapter 7, Mario's. So, starting here, part 1. 11 years had passed since Stella and I drove down Hennepin Avenue in the dead of night, and 3 years had passed since we parted. I had won a literary award that sent me to South Africa to research a novel that was never written, 2 6-week trips in 1989 and 1990. Between these trips to South Africa, I lived in New York and had studied with Edward Said. Now I was married to a South African named Kanya. We met in Johannesburg in 1989 and were married in New York at City Hall in the summer of 1990. She was a law student from Bafu, Botswana, a scattered patchwork of enclaves spread across what was then the Cape Province, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal. The land in between was called South Africa, and it tended to be more fertile than Bop, a Black Bantustan run by Black proxies for their Pretoria paymasters. Kanya, at the time, was ambivalent about law school. Her dream was to make films. Kanya had a daughter, Reba, who was 2 years old when I met her in 1989 during a state of emergency. Reba lived not in Johannesburg with Kanya, but in Bop with her grandparents. She would live there until we were settled and financially sound enough to send for her. By the summer of 1991, the summer of my graduation, I thought we'd be on a houseboat in Amsterdam, where I would write fiction and poetry when I wasn't waiting tables or teaching creative writing, and where Kanya would be in film school. In the evenings, we would string a speaker out to the deck and listen to soft jazz ballads and smoke the best weed and gaze at the languid and bittersweet Dutch as they cycled home along tranquil canals. Immigrating to South Africa, where Black people couldn't be out and about anytime and anywhere they pleased, couldn't get a meal at a restaurant they wanted, and ran the risk of being stopped at checkpoints that would choke the city like weeds without warning, was not my idea of a plan. Why not just stay in the States? Which was not an insignificant sentiment lurking beneath what happened, for Kanye suffered from the shock of seeing America show its true face of racism. The war in Kuwait, Iraq began that winter, and I came home one night and told her of the Sikh who had sat beside me and was kicked in the teeth on the subway. Why, she had asked one cold February morning in the moldy flat we shared with rodents on a hill in Washington Heights. Should I trade one South Africa for another when my family isn't even here? I often wonder if she would have stayed had I had the presence of mind to say, I'm your family. I hadn't told her what had happened to me and Stella in 1980, why we left Minneapolis and went to Dartmouth. I didn't think she could take that vision of America. As she left for the travel agent to buy a ticket, I told myself that I had been right not to tell her. Had I told her that story, she might not have come to the States at all. Kanye left in February 1991. I graduated and followed her. So for people that haven't been following along, Stella was this woman that he was, dating, who was an older woman. She was a Black radical, and he was caught up in her whirlwind of a life. And Frank said that he went to South Africa to go participate in protest movements and to help organize to fight against apartheid. So that's why he went to South Africa. He had a very strange life, and his academic career sort of like mirrors mine, or at least I hope it will mirror mine, because I graduated from university, then I took a long gap year, like 10 years before I decided to go back into university, which I'm doing right now, studying sociology, getting my bachelor's again, and hopefully my P eventually. And I want to write books. I want to be able to help organize. I want to be politically active and stuff like that. So I see a lot of mirroring in Frank's life. And in the previous chapter, chapter 6, he was talking about the story of this man, this brown-skinned man on the subway while he was living in New York, who was the victim of a hate crime, and he did nothing to stop it or to fight back against it. And Frank felt a lot of shame when he saw that. So that's background on what happened here. All right. Sorry about my lips. I put Vaseline on because there's a lot of reading to do today. So this stops my lips from getting chapped. Continuing here. From my time of arrival in 1991 to the first non-racial elections in 1994, in which I voted as a permanent resident for Mandela, I struggled alongside thousands of others to topple the apartheid government, to bring the ANC to power, and to crush white hegemony and capitalism in South Africa. Not everyone in the ANC shared the latter goal, nor were white hegemony and capitalism destroyed. Not since my adolescence had I lived through a political context in which the word revolution was used without irony, a context in which the dream of toppling a racist regime was a matter of when and how, not if. During those years, I did everything and anything that was asked of me to make this dream a reality, from legally sanctioned political organizing to insurgent tactics that would make a pacifist cringe. Pacifist is in scare quotes because the same person who condemns guerrilla warfare will pay their taxes without pause or thank a military veteran for his service. In the first instance, the pacifist disavows her identity as a mass murderer. In the second instance, she applauds in one person the behavior she condemns in another. Armed with Edward Said's mini lecture on strategic rigidity and tactical flexibility, I went to South Africa unencumbered by this mendacious mindset. In the gray zone between organizing and insurgency, I worked for the ANC Regional Peace Commission, which also served as a cover for gun-running weapons to squatter camps and townships. At the ANC Peace Commission, I wrote reports for Amnesty International and for Human Rights Watch, but as I said, we were also engaged in gun running, and we had to hide this fact in our reports, of course, because you have to be a pure victim to get support from these Western NGOs. So there was a series of disinformation initiatives that we were engaged in. In other words, we came face to face with the awful liberalism of human rights discourse and how it acts as a drag on revolutionary activity. Adham Allah says, hi, please reply. Shout out to Adham. One of the best books that I ever read. It was a punishment. So my mom got mad at me for something that I can't even remember. It was years ago, like 20 years ago at this point or something like that. And she got mad at me and she took away my phone, my computer, my video games, all that fun stuff that kids have. And she made me read Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. Big, thick book like this, 700 pages or something like that. And I read it in about a week because I really wanted my phone back and my computer. And it was one of the best books I ever read. And I really thank my mom for making me read that. And I have a lot of love and appreciation for the South African fight for freedom and the fight against white supremacy in their country. It's very inspirational. And I suggest everybody go pick up Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. Excellent book. I don't even think my mom read it, which is why she made me read it, because it was like a punishment for me because she couldn't get through it too. But yeah, if I ever have kids and they do something bad, Long Walk to Freedom. Once again, shout out to everybody in the chat. Shout out to Adham Allah. He says hi. And yeah, you'll get a shout out too if you jump in the chat. Continuing here. In addition, I also conducted political education workshops on Gramsci and other theorists for members of a clandestine Umkhonto Me Sweezy unit, and supplied the commander with political scenarios, what-if documents on the gain or loss of political capital that might result from insurrectionary initiatives. There were 3 theaters of insurgent tactics that this unit, as well as other units, focused on: secret propaganda, creating an information context or a disinformation context in the press that advanced the work of above ground mass movement structures, and the production of political broadsides that could not be attributed to MK; psychological warfare, mainly in the university industrial complex where our targets were English-speaking liberals rather than Afrikaners. The end game was to force liberals to openly wield the violence that sustains them. The overarching objective was to isolate and emasculate white liberals, English-speaking South Africans who were in key positions of power and who were against apartheid, but not in favor of a socialist dispensation. These individuals wanted an evolution from apartheid capitalism to laissez-faire capitalism. Ultimately, our goal was to turn the commanding heights of the university industrial complex into liberated zones. This would help to weaken the overall structure of racial capitalism in South Africa. Covert operations. The violent response to Inkatha and the state security forces, which often meant simply gun running to ANC-aligned self-defense units in the townships. The people I reported to were students at the University of Witwatersrand, where I taught when I first arrived, students who had been trained in the Soviet Union or in secret guerrilla bases inside South Africa. When the Soviet Union was dissolved, our supply of arms from the Soviet bloc began to dissolve as well. Unconventional and creative ways of obtaining arms were developed, such as bilking Western NGOs by working with a dedicated comrade on the inside to create a fantasy project and then funneling the bulk of the money to purchase weapons for armed struggle in the townships and squatter camps. In the daylight realm of political organizing, I was seconded to the ANC sub-regional executive, a 5-person group of political commissars for Johannesburg and the 16 surrounding townships. And Nadine Gordimer, the South African novelist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1991, nominated me to take her seat as projects coordinator on the Regional Executive Committee of the Congress of South African Writers. But none of these activities mentioned above happened overnight. I went to South Africa reluctantly, intending to stay only long enough for Kanya to finish her law degree. More disappointments and reversals were bundled into the first 6 months of our life in South Africa than I had known since the first 6 months of my life with Stella 11 years prior in Minneapolis. Had I been an Afro-pessimist and not a Marxist at the time, I might not have been so broke by it all. I would have known that the world is one big plantation. I went to work in a dreamy trattoria called Mario's in a suburb of Joburg, not far from where Kanya had returned to law school. White English-speaking South Africans called Wits the Harvard of the South. Shortly before I arrived, the government confiscated Kanya's identity documents. She was stateless now in the place of her birth, and her passport was revoked. Even if she changed her mind, we couldn't leave. The dream of Amsterdam was receding swiftly. Nor could I get permanent residency through her status as a citizen of South Africa. Kanya and I were collateral damage. Her older sister, Ribone, had been fired from her job in the finance department in BOP. Ribone's partner was an insurgent in the Azanian People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC. And he was wanted by the South African intelligence community for the transport of arms and munitions from Zimbabwe to South Africa. So Ribone was fired and placed under house arrest, and Kanya's identity documents were confiscated as well. None of this fazed me when I arrived, for I had a glowing letter of recommendation from Edward Said. Within days, I had landed a job as a junior lecturer in comparative literature. Kanye and I thought our problems were solved, but on the day before classes began, I was fired. I went to the office of the dean to sign my contract. Instead, I saw that he had a copy of my letter of recommendation for Edward Said on her desk next to a copy of the syllabus for my graduate seminar, Intellectuals and the State. The dean was aloof and pushed for time. She had no contract for me to sign. Instead, the dean told me a story. Edward Said had given a public lecture at WITS a few months before I emigrated. Our Jewish students, as she called them, rioted. She told me how they tore through campus, overturning dustbins and disturbing the peace, the kind of thing we are used to from our Black students. Apparently, her Jewish students had not agitated on campus prior to Saeed's visit. Employing me, she said, ran the risk of all that happening again, especially when the contents of the syllabus she slid it across the desk to me, got out. I pleaded with her, but she stood up and offered me her hand. It was January, the horrific month in Joburg, the coldest month in New York. It was January, the hottest month in Joburg, the coldest month in New York. I didn't go home for several hours. How would I break this news to Kanya? I read a newspaper in the dining room of Witt's Great Hall across the street from where we lived. The headlines gave no indication that our lives had been turned upside down. The Soviet Union had dissolved into the Russian Federation, which meant Cuba was now the ANC's only source of tactical support for the armed struggle. President George H.W. Bush ate something bad on a state visit to Japan and vomited on Prime Minister Kiichi Miyawaza's lap. A cleaning woman found photos of Texas millionaire John Bryan sucking the toes of the Duchess of York. What? All this happened? This is real? History. Paul Simon's tour opened in South Africa, and serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer pled guilty but insane. Not one article on the manhole I fell into that morning. The professors in comparative literature were appalled by the dean's reversal of their decision to hire me. Graduate students had already signed up for my seminar, which was to start tomorrow. I said I would teach for free, but Ulrike Kistner, a professor who I later found out worked in the underground and was a dedicated Marxist, said that would be unethical. She persuaded the chair of the department to pay my salary from Comp Lit's annual outspeakers budget. It came to less than what I would have earned had the dean not fired me, and there were no health benefits, nor would there be employment documents that I could take home to affairs to get permanent residency. Finally, at term's end, I'd be out in the cold again, but it was better than nothing. I also waited tables at Mario's several noon and night shifts a week, and I taught an evening creative writing workshop for Wits Extension, but that I was soon to find out would also come to an early end. On the evening of June 1st, 1992, as my journal records, I went straight to class from the aftermath of a massacre in Fola Park. I want to know about that. The details are complicated in that the South African Defense Force maimed and shot people and destroyed many shacks in Fola Park the day before my creative writing class. In their search for their weapons, we had smuggled into self-defense units, SDUs, in the squatter camp, while almost simultaneously, Inkatha Freedom Party paramilitaries, Impipis, had carried out a massacre of people who lived in the township, not a squatter camp. That was just a soccer pitch away from the Fola Park squatter camp. Interesting. Never heard about the Fola Park massacre. I looked around the table at 15 alabaster faces and said to myself, I can't do this. I really can't do this. Not tonight. Pretend that there are stories, that their stories and their vignettes are meaningful, or that they're ethical. Pretend that I care about them. There's Huntley Bridge, the diamond jeweler from Parktown, primed and ready to go with 15 copies of his turgid memories of the bombing of London when he was a boy. And beside him, Grace Kensington, mummified in enough makeup to open a Revlon franchise. Last week, we had to slog through a tea party for the wives of silver mine managers 10 years ago in Zambia. And young Jimmy, why can't I ever recall his last name? Jimmy Deadhead. That ought to do. How are we doing today, Jimmy? Not too cooked up, I hope. Not too coked up, I hope. If only he knew how much I hate if only he knew how much I loathe science fiction. Okay, and Muriel Mendelssohn, sweet little Muriel. She's in her mid-30s, like me. Muriel, who writes sunflower and poppy vignettes about life in a white boarding school just outside Harare when Zimbabwe was still that quaint land called Rhodesia. They vibed off of me. There's no There's no better feel good than praise from a black man. I'd become their first black friend, besides their domestics. Grace invited me to Santon for tea. Muriel wanted my help with her jazz collection. Huntley Bridge had a deal on diamonds for me. Jimmy, bless his heart, wanted to know if I got high. I had dreaded walking into that workshop. How could I have gone there after going to Fuller Park? I could have called in sick. Now I'm out of a job. I was emotionally unable to workshop Huntley's piece on English children in the air raid. I told them we'd get to it after a preliminary exercise. I passed around 15 copies of a newspaper article on the massacres. I asked them to get out their Gabriel Rico book, Writing the Natural Way, and review the section on clustering and mind mapping as a means to produce a more engaging vignette. Not the first time I'd started the session like that, but it was the first time when the word I asked them to cluster. Once it was fear, once it was love, another time it was loss. Last night it was violence, was put deliberately in context of the here and now. Why are we doing this? Said Grace. I thought we were going to work on Huntley's story. We are, but I want us to do this now. I'll do it with you. Huntley said, she asked you why. People 300, because 300 people are being killed each month in this country, and more than half of them within a 20-mile radius of this university. I can't, for the life of me, understand why you're not affected by that, seeing as how you're so deeply affected by deaths that happened 2,000 miles away and more than 50 years ago. Huntley hissed, I lived through that, slapping the table with his manuscript. You're living through this. Granted, you might not know how you're living through it. That's what the clustering helps you find out. I didn't come here to find out. Then young Jimmy, ever the chilled out peacemaker, chimed in, hey, China, like, I'm affected by it, and I'm sure Huntley is too. But what we're trying to say is that it's not just in our writing. Like, my writing isn't even about countries, China. It's about other words. Okay, I don't know what China means. I don't know if that's white South African slang for like girl or something. It sounds like it. Anyway, I got to say this. One of the most interesting things is I don't know if the word cognitive dissonance or cognitive distance it is that a lot of white folks have, but they're able to sympathize with the poverty that they see in Africa, and so they go on missionary trips with their evangelical churches to Burundi or something like that to do missionary work. But in every American city, there is another side of town that's populated with black people or other, you know, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, and that has dilapidated housing, poor sanitation, poor infrastructure, but they rather go and build houses across the world than they would for people that live in their own country that are just like them, right? And it made me think about that. Last night I was talking to my wife about when I was about in my early teens, I was forced to go on a missionary trip with my Presbyterian church that my dad was a part of. And we went to go build a house in Mexico. But when we showed up in Mexico, the houses looked exactly the same like the houses we have on the south side or the east side of Monroe, Louisiana. So it's very interesting how, in this situation, he's hanging out with a group of white folks who are talking about, things that have nothing to do with the situation that's happening in their countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, or at that time, Rhodesia, but they're writing about air raids that happened during World War II in London or Dover, whatever, right? You get what I'm saying? Like the cognitive distance that white people have to the suffering that lives around them, especially when it happens to black people, is very disturbing. Very, very disturbing. Anyway, don't call me China. You're not black. You're a white Led Zeppelin head from the suburb of Norwood. I guess China is a word for white people in South Africa. I don't know. I've never heard that. China. Anyway, we'd crossed the Rubicon. The lines were drawn. All that was left was to fight it out. Huntley told young Jimmy that he didn't have to take that. Not from him. My back stiffened at his not from him. Grace nodded. Muriel looked distressed. The rest of the class sat absolutely still. Huntley and Grace, the elder statesmen and stateswoman, gave me a thorough working over. Grace said it was a violation of etiquette to bring politics into the classroom. This is neither a Boer campus nor is it a black campus. We're neutral at places like Wits. She said she had a mind to report me to the extension school director. Huntley followed with a tirade on how he'd survived Hitler's firebombs, but my mother did not. What? He told me how he'd spent such a long time in the countryside, only to come back to London and find his mother had died. Do you have any idea what a shock that was? I was 8 years old at the time. My father brought us here to get away from that, not to rush headlong into it again. I'm nearing retirement. I want peace, and peace starts with peace of mind. It was like group therapy, where I was both the trauma and the cure. Okay, I said at last, now that you've had your say, let's scan the news clippings and the images, then write the word violence in the center of an unlined sheet of paper. Cluster the mind map in Word, then write your vignettes. As usual, we'll take 15 minutes for the whole exercise. Whoever wants to share what when we're done can share. It's okay if you don't. Huntley balled up my newspaper clippings and threw it behind him. You haven't heard a word we've said. I don't even read the bloody newspapers. My days are hard enough. Do you know what's happened to my diamond sales during all these years of the sanctions? I'm a British subject. I'm not a Boer. This violence has nothing to do with me. I've always said live and let live. Okay, the interesting thing about South Africa is that technically, from my understanding, I've never been to South Africa and I only have a rudimentary understanding from the documentaries I've watched, the books I've read, and stuff like that. But there's two sets of white people in South Africa. You have the Boers and the Brits. The Boers are descendants from like the Dutch settlers, and the Brits are, of course, from British settlers when they took over the Dutch colony, right? And the from my understanding, the Brits like to claim, we weren't a part of the creating of this South African project, right? We sort of just showed up, and we're not as racist as the Boers who were here earlier and enslaved Africans and stole their land and killed them and stuff like that. So it's very interesting. It mirrors a lot of how white Americans think. They always have some recent grandfather who showed up in 1911 or 1920, or we just got here yesterday, so we don't have anything to do with slavery or oppression or Jim Crow or redlining or none of that, right? And number one, that's a big fallacy too, because many white people are descended from slave owners, slave holders. This is a fact, because your grandfather might have showed up in 1911, but most white people marry other white people. So in your lineage, you are descended from slave owners. Very, very likely. Just like how it's very possible. In fact, I'm a living testament to that. Many black people who are, phenotypically black, undescribably, only describably black, might have a Nigerian parent and a parent who's African American, generational African American, right? And so now that child's lineage goes back to what? American slavery. You get what I'm saying? Like me, my mother's from Belize, my dad is a black American from Alabama. My lineage goes back to slavery in the Americas, if not from Belize as well. You get what I'm saying? So same thing for a lot of the whites. A lot of the whites intermarry, and a lot of the whites have history to the people that have historically oppressed us. Yeah, I'm going to continue here though. So you're a diamond seller, Huntley. I folded my hands on the table and very calmly told him, you've got blood all over you. The rest of you pay apartheid taxes and vote. What more of a connection to these massacres do you need? Huntley rose to his feet. He snatched the copies of his manuscript from the people around him and stuffed them into a satchel. Muriel Mendelssohn had been listening in distress, as though she were reliving some horrible scolding from the headmistress in her Rhodesian boarding school. Now her voice cracked as she spoke. We were all happy in your class. Now look what's happening. You came here with an agenda, like you're having a problem, so you're going to impose your neurosis onto us. I came here straight from Fuller Park, where slowly Huntley sat back down. What were you doing in Fuller Park? I worked for the ANC Peace Come. I bloody well knew it, Huntley cried. He wants to brainwash us, said Grace Kensington, looking around for confirmation. I'm leaving, Huntley said, but he remained seated. This fellow can't help us with our writing. Muriel said, after tea, we can all come back and be sensible. Tea is going to be delayed for the 15 minutes it takes to do this exercise, I told them. Okay, he's got a room full of pissed off white folks. What you doing, Frank, making these good white folks mad? Don't you know? Don't you know? Don't you know you shouldn't be doing that, boy? All right. Grace was incredulous. No tea, rubbish. First, you turn our creative writing class into a communist re-education camp. Then you inflict tea deprivation. We are not your slaves. I started laughing. You think I'm funny? I'm a joke to you? You live in Sandton, don't you, Grace? Don't answer that, Grace, Huntley scoffed. The man's a sophist. Where she lives has nothing to do with tea. How many other people live in Sandton? I went on. 4 of the 15 students lived in Sandton. The rest of them lived in other rich white suburbs near to Sandton, such as Rosebank and Parktown, where Nadine Gordimer lived. Well policed enclaves for the British. Those under 40 lived east in Yellville, Norwood, or Bellevue East, where apartments could be found. I told them some things they knew already, that no more than a thin highway separated Sandton from the black township of Alexandra. Alex had a population of 400,000 residents living in one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Sandton had wide boulevards, sprawling parks, a five-star shopping mall, and houses the size of citadels. Did anyone know what percentage of the people in Sandton had electricity? They scoffed at the ridiculousness of this question and said 100%. Right. Well, what was it? What was it in Alex? No one knew. 20%. That meant 300,000 out of 400,000 people, or more than a quarter of a million people who lived right across the street from them, didn't have electricity. Still don't see how this gets back to tea, Huntley said lazily. Since they don't have the electricity, it's safe to assume that they don't have the elaborate burglar alarm systems on their shacks that you all have. There's no early warning system when they get killed in the night. Not that anyone would come if there was. How is it that the electricity that you take for granted can't cross the street? And why is it that the massacres they take for granted won't cross the street to your homes? Grace insisted that the people of Sandton were not responsible for the lack of electricity in Alexandria, and that they were certainly not responsible for the violence. The violence is black on black, Zulu against Xhosa, she said. You don't see white men hacking each other with pangas. Oh, the cringe, the level of cringe right now. Oh, this is infuriating, infuriating. Would she agree, I asked, that since July 1990, Inkatha Impipis have been streaming into the Transvaal in record numbers? She told me Impipi was a derogatory term. How would I like to be called nigger? I decided to ignore that and change the word to warriors. She insisted upon migrants, and rather than ask her if she moonlighted as Gotcha's publicist, I agreed on migrants. Mangatsu Garsha Buthelezi was the chief minister of the KwaZulu Bantustan, where I worked at Mario's. He was also the founder and president of the Inkatha Freedom Party. Okay. More than 100,000 of them have streamed in here over the past 2 years. You don't need to read the newspapers to know this. Just look outside your window. Yes, she conceded. Have they been attacking? Let me rephrase that. Have they been at the center of this violence? Yes. Do they burn down the houses of township residents? Do they shoot and maim people in their sleep? Do they abduct women from the trains? I have no knowledge of that. Grace, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. All you have to do is open your window and look across the street. They've run the multi-ethnic working men out of the hostels. They kill the residents and anyone they think supports the ANC. The police give them arms and take them wherever they want to go in huge vans. Fine, what's your point? The Sandton City Council pays the rent for these hostels, which means you pay their rent. That's my point. But you say the violence has nothing to do with you? Doesn't sound like black on black violence to me. Not when the guns are white, the logistical support is white, and the money is white. Huntley stood up. All those in favor of tea, follow me. With the expeditionary zeal of a tour guide in Trafalgar Square, he led all but 4 of them from the room. With moist eyes, Muriel Mendelssohn approached me. You must think we're really repressed, she said. I didn't know what to say. Yeah, they're repressed, and white folks are white folking. Yeah, that's just, oh God, that's my nightmare. This is why I don't even talk about racism to white folks in general, because they, like Agent Smith in The Matrix, they all transform and they all say the same shit, and it's so annoying, and there's no getting through to them because they're like children. They're literally like children. All right. A day later, the director of University Extension telephoned. She had received a complaint from the head of the Sandton City Council. She said she did not approve of an adjunct at Wits slandering the Sandton municipality. I had also received a phone call from another member of the City Council who demanded I present myself at the council's next meeting and retract statements that I made implicating them in the violence. She said that if I didn't pitch up at the next council meeting, they would initiate civil and perhaps criminal proceedings against me. That if I wasn't prosecuted, I could be detained. The university traded on goodwill. The director of University Extension intoned. I was hired because I had an MFA in fiction, not a PhD in political science. They would not need me to teach creative writing in the next term. Now Mario's Trattoria was all I had left. Part 3. Mario's restaurant sported a sunken dining room. When patrons and waiters inclined their heads to look out the long, slender windows that ran along the upper reaches of Mario's inner walls, they glimpsed the pageantry of smartly creased pants cuffed above business shoes and the trendy pumps or high heels of white women bustling back and forth between the sneakers that black women wore or the scuffed work shoes of black men who worked in the same suburban office buildings, serving tea, cleaning toilets, mending pipes, and guarding the front door against people who looked just like them. The dining room itself was small, but a floor-to-ceiling mirror yawned across the far wall, giving the room the feel of a candlelit cavern that opened a moonstruck sea at night. 2 or 3 times a night, Dean Martin's rendition of Volare played in the loop of romantic ballads that pulsed from the speakers in the corners of the ceiling. I loved to watch the faces of the patrons when the song came on. I could always tell the patrons who were there for the first time from those who had been there before. The newcomer's first response was always one of astonishment, as if they wanted to ask why everyone stopped talking. Why, they seemed to ask themselves, are these businessmen's heads cocked and poised with the stillness of hunting hounds? Why had the wedding table's toast been triaged? Why did lovers lean away from each other at the bars of the intro as the bars of the intro were played? I once saw a throng at Nadine Gordimer's dinner guests look at the Nobel laureate as though she'd lost her mind when she cut the conversation and held her index finger aloft. Her friend's sense of confusion lasted less than 2 seconds, just long enough for the first 2 syllables of Volare to leave Dean Martin's lips. Then all the voices in Mario's ascended in a blue whale of sound. Let's fly away up to the clouds, away from the maddening crowds. Even newcomers caught by surprise swayed in their seats and sang along. Everyone loved Mario's. Mario and his cousin Sandro had come to South Africa in the uh, recent flow of Southern and Eastern Europeans, the Portuguese who crossed the border with Mozambique, licking their wounds from having lost their war, Romanians, Czechs, and Germans from the GDR with dust from the demolished Berlin Wall still on their shoes, Greeks and Italians like Sandro and Mario. 2 Romanians in their early 30s, both with engineering degrees and no outlet for their knowledge in the rubble of Com-Econ, where the old was dying, but the new had not been born, worked as waiters. 2 Africans who had also worked as waiters, one a man without papers who hailed from Zimbabwe's Matabeleland, the other one at least 15 years older than all of us, which put him in his late 40s or early 50s, came from Venda, the Bantustan in the far northern corner of South Africa, just this side of the border with Zimbabwe. Tonight was the man Knight was the name of the man from Zimbabwe who was an illegal immigrant like me. The older man from Venda, who sent his pay back to his wife and kids in the Bantustan, was called Master by everyone, including Mario and his wife, Rihanna. We were a patchwork assemblage from the land of misfit toys, serving penne, fettuccine, and eggplant lasagna to bankers, businessmen, professors, and tourists under the watchful gaze of little Napoleon, standing on the landing beside his long-legged Josephine. Rihanna was a tall, striking woman of Afrikaans descent, born and raised in a Klein Dorpie, a wide spot on a tarred road somewhere in the Karoo. We were all new to Joburg: Mario, Sandro, Knight, Master, and 2 Romanians and me. The alcove between the dining room and the thick, two-way swinging doors to the kitchen was my hideaway. A counter ran along the half wall, separating this dimly lit snug from the rest of the dining room. Plastic, compartmentalized crates, each holding 25 water glasses, were stacked 4 feet high at the far end of the counter. It was the job of the waitstaff to see to it that the 50 glasses in the top 2 racks were turned right side up and filled with ice water. I could stand behind these porous crates and survey the entire dining room, even the 7 steps that led to the landing with the cash register and menu stand. In the evening, the ceiling lights were dimmed and candles burned romantically on the tables. Dean Martin sang Volare, and the diners sang as well. As a meeting ground for the major white intellectual and political actors who were part of the seismic shifts the country was embroiled in, Mario's was an embarrassment of riches. I saw Rolf Myers, F.W. de Klerk's former Minister of Constitutional Development, dining in the candlelight with his wife. When I arrived in South Africa in 1991 and began working at Mario's, de Klerk had just appointed Rolf Meyer, Minister of Defense, as successor to Magnus Malan. The generals didn't like him, and other hardliners on the right called him "Verligit Nat," a liberal or enlightened National Party politician who didn't harbor the proper sentiments towards communism and the Zwart Gevaar, or black threat. He lasted at that job about as long as I lasted at Mario's, and from the alcove where I watched him dine, I could see why. His dinner guests spoke English, not just to me and the other waiters, but among themselves, which meant that they were English genealogically, or they were members of a new breed of Afrikaners who emerged from the shadows of 1989 when de Klerk came to power. Urbane Boers, self-conscious about world opinion. Rolf Meyer was the poised and polished poster boy for this new breed. The only black patron that I recall were celebrities like the likes of stage and screen stars John Connie and Thembi Mtshali. The evening crowd was better dressed and more relaxed than the hurried noonday business diners. What surprised me was the degree to which the people working at Mario's, from Rihanna to Mario to the two Romanis to Master and Tonight, the two African writers, were clueless about the significance of the clientele, especially when it came to the dinner guests. From white liberal academics who made their names as consultants to COSATU and law professors who advised the moderate faction of the ANC when they weren't lecturing 4 blocks away at the University of the Witwatersrand, to power brokers like Rolf Meyer, famous actors in the literati, a phalanx of faces known around the world to anyone who kept up with the changes occurring at a staggering pace, sauntered down the steps to Mario's sunken dining room and tucked into plates of penne smothered in arrabbiata and smoked salmon while washing it down with the best sangria in South Africa. Everyone loved Mario's, but not everyone who worked at Mario's knew they were feeding the highly placed notables whose hands were forging their future. The first time I espied the first time I espied Nadine Gordimer, she was dining with her husband and a guest from England. As Rihanna passed through the alcove where Master Denight and the Romanians and I observed our tables without being seen, I told her that Nadine Gordimer was the last person I expected to be in a room with whom I moved to South Africa. Rihanna said, "Which one is she?" I was bowled over. "You're kidding, right?" She was hurt by this, and I was sorry. It was a spontaneous and unintentional put down. 3 months ago, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. "Oh, yeah, I read about that," Rihanna lied. Master and Denai agreed that she was a kind white lady who said please and thank you, even to Africans. The Romanians accused me of making this up. I asked them who had watered Nadine's party. When one of the Romanians nodded, I told him to let me come to the table with him when it was time to take the order. If I was lying about anything I just said, I promised to give him my entire haul in tips for the night. But if I was telling the truth, he would give me all of his tips. He didn't like the wager, so I modified it. If I'm lying, I said, you still get all my tips, but if I'm telling the truth, then I'll take her table and her tips. How do you know her? He scoffed. I could tell he was getting cold feet, but he had to save face in front of Rihanna and the others. Gordimer, I observed, paid more attention to her guests from England than to her husband, Reinhold Kasserer. Gordimer was then 68 years old. Reinhold had been one of South Africa's most influential art dealers in the 1970s and a South African army captain seconded to British intelligence in Cairo during World War II. Still with a strong trace of a German accent. He was a German Jew of substantial means whose family fled Berlin when Hitler came to power. Now he was 83, 15 years her senior. This Jewish Holocaust refugee turned dashing spy turned art dealer was, no doubt, the brightest flare in her sky. But all flares dim on the way down. Reinhold, with an oxygen aid, was no different. Before the Romanian could take their order, I spoke. I introduced myself by telling her how much her work had meant to me as a writer. It wasn't the whole truth, but it got her attention. The truth was that her politics had meant a lot to me, but I was enthralled by the writing of J.M. Coetzee, whom I considered to be a better storyteller and a more profound wordsmith, though I loathed his politics. This young man, I said, referring to the Romanian with a tincture of condescension, as well as Mario and his wife Rihanna, asked me to offer you our congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. In her eyes, I saw the gears of vanity and skepticism turning in on each other. In that thin, still voice, I would grow accustomed to over the next 2 years. Nadine Gordimer asked why they had nominated me to make this little speech. She didn't flatter easily. In a shrewd pedagogic move, I turned to the Romanian and said, "Good question. Why did you all give me this honor?" He was hemmed in by the truth, but determined to escape. Because you taught her work at Columbia, he consented with all the gusto one might have for a pending root canal. Where Saeed is, she said. I told her that I had studied with him. The Romanian looked like what he was, a man who lost a bet. Nadine asked if I could remain as their waiter. She had a project that she wanted to discuss with me. Now, I've worked in customer service, like in fancy places, like in Miami and stuff like that. And one of the things they tell us, like working in customer service, when you see famous people walk in, is like act normal. Do not say anything to them. If you even try to say hello, you will be fired, right? So I'm very shocked at his boldness here. But, fortune favors the bold. So shout out to Frank for doing this. But I don't know who Nadine Gordimer is. I've never read her work. I'm not a big fiction person. Don't read a lot of fiction, but maybe I should. Maybe I'll check her out. She sounds like I don't know, old school racist white woman though. I don't know. I don't know Nadine Gordimer. Fill me in. So going to part 4. Hold on. Okay. Africans were not allowed to touch money at most high-end and even some low-end retail establishments. But what I was in the minds of Mario and Rihanna. But what was I in the minds of Mario and Rihanna? Mario ran the kitchen, Rihanna ran the dining room. He was a European, she was an Afrikaner. From the landing beside the front door, Rihanna watched the black waiters like a barn owl over mice. When guests left their table for the night, she swooped down the steps and scooped up the tips that masters and the night's guests had left. If she wasn't on the landing, they would clear an entire table and reset it with cloth napkins, cutlery, and glasses without touching one note or coin. At the end of every shift, Rihanna divided the tip jar for blacks between master and night. Since they didn't know how much they earned each night, they didn't know if she was cheating them. My first day on the job, I shadowed Master during the lunch and the dinner shifts, so all the tips belonged to him. When I asked him why he and Denight let Rihanna take their tips while the two Romanians collected their own, he smiled and shrugged and said, "This is South Africa and China." I said, fuck the dumb shit. And we both laughed. He thought I was playing. When my first table on my first shift paid the bill, they paid it to me. The man at the table who was paying started to lay the bill I had just given him, along with his wrinkled rand notes, on the table, but I held out my hand. "I'll take that for you," I said, smiling. He looked at me as though I'd spoken Serbo-Croatian. I realized that perhaps he had never paid an African directly before. Finally, slowly, he gave me the bill back and gave me the money too. "I'll bring your change." He told me the change was the tip. My back was to the landing where I was certain Rihanna was watching. I lingered for a moment with the people at the table. I could almost feel her squirm. On the landing, I gave her the bill and the cash. Her jaw looked as clenched as my stomach felt. I smiled. She counted the notes into the cash register. She kept the change. "I'll see he gets it," she said. "It's my tip." I held out my hand. "You can ask him." She wasn't happy, but she gave it to me. The first time there was a credit card transaction, she cashed the customer out and kept my tip. I walked up the steps to the landing. "My tip," I said, nodding at the register. My heart raced. Anxiety burned 10 years of my life. Rihanna snubbed out her imported Gauloises cigarettes. I had not moved. The cash register chimed and opened, but instead of putting my tip in the African tip jar, she put the money on the ledge beside the register. I put the money in my pocket. She didn't say a word. This reminds me of like when I was first started working at McDonald's, right? They only put white people on the register. It just made me, I just remember that. I worked at 2 fast food joints simultaneously, like in between college or waiting to go to college. And I was at Taco Bell and McDonald's. And I noticed every single time the only people that could be on the register in racist ass Monroe, Louisiana were the white folks. Never saw any of the black people unless it was a woman for some reason, but there was never be a black man at the register. It was always a woman or a white person. Anyway, continuing here. Nicholas and Sifo were both muscular men with hands more callous than any cooks I'd worked with stateside. They must have been from the country, I thought, or done some form of hard outdoor work before they came to Mario's. The only time they came into the dining room was to go home after a shift or to set food on the long staff table where Mario, Rihanna, Sandro, and the two Romanians ate their lunch. On day one, I went to the kitchen with Master and Denight, where they ate pap and fleece. What the hell is pap and fleece? Mealy porridge, fleece meat. Okay, South African cuisine, everybody. All right. So one day I went to the kitchen with Master and Denight where they ate pap and fleece with their fingers along with Nicholas, Sifo, and the kitchen crew. Why did the black waiters eat porridge and tough meat while the whites ate penne with creamy salmon and vodka sauce? I asked them. I settled in to eat with them when Sandro, Mario's cousin, came into the kitchen. He said Mario and Rihanna wanted to know if I cared to join them at the waiter's table in the restaurant. Was I black or was I an American? Perhaps they flipped a coin to decide. I don't know what rankled me more, my invitation as an honorary white or the sense of pride I interpreted in the smiles of the kitchen crew, as though their own Jackie Robinson were in the majors now. I told Sandro to tell Mario and Rihanna that I was just fine with the blacks. Sandro understood immediately. He told me to stop being a jerk and learn to appreciate what it means to be accepted. I told him I'd be there in a minute. When he left, I told Master and Tonight that I would go out there only if they came too. They looked at me as though I'd given them consecutive life sentences. They told me how much they liked flat pap and fleece. It was, after all, Master said, an African dish. You like it better than Italian food? I queried. They nodded. I asked them how much Italian food they'd had since working there. Crickets. How can you serve food you've never eaten? I asked Master and Denight. If you can describe the taste of food to a customer and then tell them which of our wines go best with their order, they'll be pleased and your tips will go through the roof. Come on, let's go out there and eat. All conversation stopped when the three of us entered the dining room. I thought I was going to have to fold Master and Denight into their chairs. So petrified were they by the look on Rihanna's face. Mario was trying to be stern, but he didn't have his wife's chops. When they were seated, I served them and then myself. Master and Denight loved the food. The table was so silent throughout the entire meal that we could hear the voices of pedestrians on the sidewalk beyond the glass. This reminds me of when I was living in Tunisia, I was bumming on this guy Zied's couch. He owned like an Italian style restaurant and stuff like that. And yeah, it just reminds me of the food and the flavors, like the vodka sauce. The stuff he would cook would be fire. Zied was a fire cook, even though he turned out to be an asshole. But another thing, when I was living in Tunisia, there's a bunch of black people in Tunisia, a bunch of African, well, people from Black Africa who are migrating to Tunisia to either study or to work there, whatever, right? And there's also a lot of indigenous Black people who are Tunisian, right? And whenever you go to a Tunisian establishment, in the back, ton of Black people working, cooking, cleaning, never in the front. Never in the front. I only saw one Black person in the front one time cooking, but never on the register, nothing like that. Racism worldwide. Anyway, continuing here. When the lead cashier quit, several African women entered the trattoria to apply for the job, but each was told the position had been filled. After the third time, I confronted Rihanna and Mario about this. At the time, I believed that I had caught them red-handed in an act of discrimination. Now, through the lens of Afro-pessimism, I can see that it was more complicated, or perhaps more elemental than that. Something else was at stake. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx mentions but cannot or will not theorize the slave. For Marx, the worker is the host upon which civil society feeds, and the worker is also the engine of revolution, the sentient being whose liberation will destroy capitalism and, by extension, the world as we know it. Das Kapital, however, suffers from an insufficiently comparative analysis between the position of the worker and the position of the slave. Marx calls the slave a speaking implement, which I have argued is indeed an apt description, one that deserves careful reflection. But Marx makes this observation and moves on. Marx is as mute and astonished by this speech-endowed subject, who is not a proper subject, as Mario and Rihanna were when I called them out on the way they treated the Black women who applied for the cashier's job. Mario and Rihanna had lived in the midst of black waiters, black cooks, black women who made salads and desserts, and the black dishwashers, much as Edwin Epps and his wife Mary Epps in the film 12 Years a Slave lived among their slaves. It would not occur to Edwin and Mary to camouflage their ill treatment of their implements, their slaves. In a tool shed, one doesn't break a wrench and wonder how the hammer feels about it. True, up the 7 steps from the dining room and out the front door, the world of rational political change and debate was impinging on Mario's Trattoria. There might even be a black president in South Africa before the 20th century waned, but Mario's was a dim recess in the skull of the city, not unlike the unconscious, a realm of what Freud called primary signification, where relational logic had diminished purchase. There is no time in the unconscious. There's tenacious fixation, lethal consumption, phantasmagoric couplings, and the shortest path to pleasure, mobilized by force. Edwin and Mary discuss the most intimate details of their marriage when they fight in the parlor right in front of their slaves. They slash each other with aspects of their sexuality and their past that they would be loath to discuss in front of their closest friends. Yet somehow these slaves, these speaking implements, are not a threat. They remain, to paraphrase Saidiya Hartman, unthought. It is as though Edwin and Mary are not downstairs in the parlor, but upstairs in their bedroom, alone and unclothed, with only the eyes of the furniture on their naked bodies. Indeed, they are alone. For the parlor is not people with interlocutors, but rather is decorated with a menagerie of objects, some of which are animate. Mario's trattoria doubled as Edwin and Mary's parlor. They tore at each other in front of the Africans. In front of the kitchen crew, he would yell at Rihanna with a flurry of hand gestures. He would tell her how she could return to tending drought-hardy cows in the Karoo if she kept complaining about the way he made sexual advances to Sibongile and Liana, the two women who made salads, and she would remind him that he wouldn't have a visa and she would remind him that he wouldn't have a visa if it weren't for her. No visa, no restaurant, and she'd say as her voice rose an octave. Mario and Rihanna weren't so much embarrassed, much less shamed by my calling them out as they were startled by the observation and judgment of one of their implements. Imagine Mary Epps' shock if, the moment she had attacked Edwin Epps' manhood in the parlor, Patsy, the slave he raped with love on a regular basis, said, "You are so right, Mary. He's Lothario." Mary's shock would be short-lived, of course, given all her numerous demands that Edwin whip or sell Patsy. One can't imagine the conversation progressing. For Mary Epps would have killed Patsy. Mario, and Rihanna had lived the unthought of these sentients that surrounded them for years, just as Mary and Edwin Epps had done. Just my little thought right here. You notice this sometimes. White folks love to slum it up around black people. So, what he's saying here is that, Mario and Rihanna, the two white people who basically run this establishment, they're in the front and they have this posh restaurant, and then they go into the back where all the black people are working, and then they go there and they turn up and they go, "Mamma mia, pizzeria," talking with their hands and being loud and uh, rude and basically obtuse and just gross, you know what I mean? Because they think that's how black people are and stuff like that. And what, Frank is saying here is that white folks around black people feel like they can let their hair down because around us, they don't view us as people. So they're talking in ways that, no person would talk in front of another person that could overhear what they're saying and have judgments about them. But because they're not worried about what we say, because we're not humans, we're just objects around them that exist. And so they can, I believe on one hand, it's like performative because they want to show that they're down. So white folks, act very ghetto, ratchet, if there's another word to say it, around black folks to show that they're down. And because around us, they feel like they're closer to some like primal type of energy, some more savage form of humanity, so they can let loose and let their hair down a bit and then transform when they go into the stage again, right? But while they're backstage, they're around objects that have no agency and no ability to speak for themselves. And also at the same time, they're putting on a performance for those same objects that they want the objects to approve of them, if that makes sense. That's what I think. That's what I think. All right. So it took them several beats before they could respond to my accusation of employment discrimination. For a moment, they both were speechless. I took their aphasia for guilt. I could not have been more wrong. Then Rihanna did something strange. She smiled. Master and Denight were setting up their sections and trying not to be aware of what was unfolding, but Master's face tightened with worry lines that made him look much older than the 50-year-old face in the passbook he continued to carry, despite the fact that the pass law was repealed. He was a generation older than me, old enough to have seen before a smile like that made to a man like me by a woman like Rihanna. Old enough to have seen before a smile like that made to a man like me by a woman like Rihanna. It was not the smile of fellowship. It was not the smile of sex. Master knew his place, and he knew Master knew his place, and he needed to help me know mine. So he asked me to bring him 4 of my folded linen napkins. I'm running short, he lied. Rihanna said that what she told the 3 black women about the job being taken was a white lie meant to shield the girls from a loss of self-esteem. I would have laughed, but Master's tense caution has seeped into me. Rihanna's voice was edged with condescension. Telling them the job had been filled, she went on, was a lot better for their self-esteem than telling them they weren't qualified. Mario stood beside her, nodding. Now, I laughed, you're a class act, a real humanitarian. Mario thrust his finger at me from his elevated perch on the landing beside her. What's so funny, he said. 3 white lies for 3 black women, I replied. You're laughing at my wife, the muscles in his neck pulsed. You kidding? I admire her compassion. Master said, Frank, I'm out of serviettes. Can I have your extras? I didn't reach for the napkin or acknowledge his request. I knew damn well he had all the napkins he needed for his section. Mario started down the steps. Rihanna grabbed the sleeve of his chef's jacket, which was white with cloth knot buttons. I pressed on. Only a clairvoyant would know they weren't qualified before reading their resumes. A puddle of silence grew between us. In my mind's eye, I saw Mario's black windswept hair, his powerful hands seared with rage, his white vested chest lunging down at me over the railing. Rihanna said, what kind of American are you? And I laughed again. Mario shook free of her grasp. Frank, Master's voice hammered. I turned to face him. The serviettes in China. All right. This is another thing too. Black Americans, like, we stand up for our rights. You know what I mean? A lot of Africans, a lot of other black people, you know, they the white supremacy beat them down so hard that just the idea of challenging powerful white people when they're being explicitly racist terrifies them. And white people definitely don't like that. So yeah, black Americans, we should be proud of that. I'm proud of Frank for doing this. If this story actually happened the way he said it happened, I've been in situations like that too, where I bring up the racism that I see around me by white folks, and they get all hot under the collar and turn all red and the horns grow out of their forehead and stuff like that. So yeah, shout out to Frank for being a real G, representing our heritage right. Anyway, continuing here. Master's concern for my safety was something I felt at a profound pre-linguistic level, so much so that I pressed him to put it in words. He was always the first person to reach the locker room and change from his street clothes to his waiter's uniform. Master had been with Mario and Rihanna since the beginning. Not even Nicholas and Sifo, 2 fixtures in the kitchen, had been there as long as Master. The work Master did for Mario and Rihanna went well beyond his expertise as a waiter. He could fix the air conditioning, he could break the gas range down and reassemble it, and he liaised with the laundry service that washed the linen. That is, before Sandro, Mario's cousin, immigrated from a village near Naples and was paid to do what Master had done for free. This diminished his pride, and he responded by smiling even more. But he hadn't smiled when he saw me on the bench, violating his space and solitude. Everyone knew that this time belonged to Master, and everyone but me seemed to respect that. Even Sibon Gile and Liana, the 2 women who made salads, slathered butter on warm garlic bread, and helped the dishwasher when he was slammed, timed their arrival to the interval between Master's arrival and the arrival of male kitchen crew and waiters. In this way, Master could have the time that everyone except me knew that he needed, and Sibingole and Liana could charge before the men arrived to witness them disrobing. I waited on the bench to the side of the door so that I could see him a few seconds before he saw me when he entered the locker room. As the door opened and he came into view, I saw his shoulders sag with the weight of the day that had not yet begun. He was muttering a soft, anxious splutter of English and Venda that he spoke into his neck. The door closed behind him. It was too late by the time he saw me. Too late to change. Like Clark Kent in a phone booth, into his superhero smile. I had heard the reluctant heel to toe shuffle of his shoes on the cement floor, and I had tasted the rot, resignation, and regret in the ruins of words. The expression on his face was one that I had never imagined he was capable of. It was an expression of anger, almost hatred. I wondered if anyone in the world, even his wife and children in Venda, had ever seen Mester's face like this, without that eternal white smile pressed into the landscape of his glowing onyx-colored hair. He blinked, then he smiled. The world was set right again. I felt a jolt of shame. I apologized. For what? He asked in a voice that was reassuring. You belong here as much as I do. Even though I wasn't sure I meant it, I thanked him for trying to diffuse yesterday's confrontation. He turned his back to me and spun the dial on his combination lock. I wanted to ask you about that, I said. Master was in need of serviettes, he told me, speaking of himself in the third person. Master didn't mean to give problems, bruh, Frank. Okay, he flashed that infuriating, inscrutable smile. Talking in the third person, that's so cringe, very cringe. All right. This annoyed me. I was not his age mate. According to tribal customs, he was an elder. Master had no cause to show deference to me by calling me brah, for brother or uncle, as though I were his elder. This Negro signifying, I thought with bitterness. Yesterday he called me Frank, with the urgency and command one would use on a subordinate. Now he becomes an inscrutable African and treats me like a man twice his age, or like a white man, someone to be lied to with respect. I wanted to tell him to forget it and then walk out. He made eye contact with me in the mirror as he clipped on his bow tie. What he said next surprised me. It had nothing to do with the words I had exchanged with Mario and Rihanna. Master sat down on the bench across from me. With seriousness, I would have thought him incapable of, Master said. Do you have any idea where you are? At the ass end of the world, I wanted to say, where I could be in Amsterdam, laid back with a blunt. Where am I, Master? South Africa, he said firmly. Then he told me that Mario had a short fuse. Nothing I didn't know. He said he didn't want Mario to assault me, which he might have. Had I kept insulting his wife, I said that she was insulting my intelligence, and I asked him if he thought I couldn't handle a man as small as Mario. Master waited a moment, as if deciding if I was worth the candle of his wisdom, or if he should go out and start setting up the dining room, let me find the landmines on my own. That's when he told me that he had been afraid not of what Mario would do to me, but what Nicholas and Sifo might have done. They might have killed you, he said. I looked at him as though he had said he'd just returned from vacation on the moon. The chef and the sous chef, I said in disbelief, they're black. I said maybe he was the one who didn't know where he was. Nicholas and Sifo are black men who Mario uses as doormats. Why would they come to his aid? I implored. When I was standing up for three black women. I took advantage of Master's wordless expression to remind him of my efforts to organize a union at Mario's. I reminded him of the African National Congress pamphlets and brochures that I regularly slipped into the hands of the workers when Mario, Rihanna, the Romanians, and Sandro's backs were turned. Whenever a massacre occurred in the Transvaal, whether it was 46 people killed in the Joe Slovo squatter camp or 10 people killed in Mapetla, the crew in the kitchen, as well as he and the night, could count on me to come to work the next day with literature explaining the political implications of the paramilitary alliance between the IFP and the South African Security Branch. I had begun my political work in the ANC the second week I arrived in South Africa, and I was steadfast in my conviction that one must organize where one lives. I did not want to mimic the lives of immigrants I had seen in the U.S. who had either cobbled their new lives together on the backs of Black Americans who were less likely to be employed than a disciplined and grateful newcomer, or who had simply done their best not to bear witness to the suffering around them. Very, very powerful paragraph. I love that paragraph. Within a month of my arrival, I had become active in the above ground political structures of the ANC, like the ANC Peace Commission, which monitored and tried to prevent the rash of massacres that the police, the SADF, and the Inkatha Freedom Party carried out in the townships surrounding Johannesburg. Of course, I never told the workers at Mario's that the ANC Peace Commission was also a handmaiden of the ANC's armed struggle, secreting weapons into squatter camp self defense units. But Master reminded me that I had distributed a position paper written by a mid level MK operative, which argued that the liberation movement should not get hoodwinked by the liberal argument that all violence was unethical, that the violence of the apartheid government and its surrogates in Inkatha was not to be equated with the revolutionary response of the liberation movement. All of which I told Master with a tone of finality and resolve should make perfect sense to any black person who's worked at this restaurant, this miniature plantation, for 5 minutes. Of course, Master said, surprising me with a level of sarcasm I would never imagine his open, smiling face was capable of. That explains why Nicholas chased Fana with a knife in the kitchen because he caught him reading a book you gave him. Fana was the dishwasher, a teenage boy who said he was 18 but looked like he was 15. Fana probably wasn't his name, it means boy, but that's what he was called. I knew the answer to the question I didn't need to ask, but I asked it anyway. Why would Nicholas do that? Master shook his head and started to leave. Okay, this is really, really bad. This is a horrible situation. You're saying Nicholas and Saifo are Inkatha supporters? I felt cold and moist. For weeks, I had ordered food from and chatted with men with knives who were members or supporters of the IFP. I had the gall to assume that they wanted what I wanted out of the mass struggle waging in the streets. The heights of such insolence was the fact that I had deputized myself on their behalf, and I didn't even know who they were. Nicholas and Saifo were livid with me, and their rage had simmered for weeks without my having the slightest inkling. Nicholas and Saifo may have come to the Transvaal from their homes in KwaZulu-Natal. Their migration from the Indian Ocean to the rolling killing fields of the Joburg townships might have coincided with the influx of an estimated 100,000 Zulu Contra forces like F.W. de Klerk had mobilized to move to Joburg's townships and put a black face on the apartheid government's aggression. Only a fool would try to organize them into a union aligned to the ANC. I was that fool. Yeah, so basically, he's got raccoons in his mix. Basically, it sounds like these guys are a part of a, you know, like black Confederate soldiers, right? Like these guys are fighting for the apartheid government, but they're black themselves. So yeah, crazy that he's in this situation, but he couldn't detect it. Couldn't detect it. Couldn't check it out. I don't know. All right, but why hadn't Nicholas and Saifo confronted me when I first started? I asked Master this question, but he just shrugged. Then I asked him what happens next. He shrugged again, but he said it wouldn't be hard for them to deal with me and not pay the price for it if they said they were trying to protect a white man and his wife. Ah. I stayed in the locker room after Master had gone. I was embarrassed, and when that wore off, I was scared. To my surprise, Rihanna and Mario hired an African woman for the cashier position. Okay, victory, victory, victory. All right. Her name was Doreen. The contrast between Doreen and Rihanna could not have been greater. Rihanna's only certification was what in the States would be a junior college degree in hotel management, whereas Doreen held a BS in business and accounting from the Homeland University of Botswana. Nor would nor could there be greater dissonance between the way they dressed and carried themselves. Rihanna flounced through the restaurant in jeans so tight she might have been poured into them. In the summer months, December and January, she wore retro hot pants from the 1970s. She smoked imported Galosi's cigarettes that she often snubbed out and abandoned after a single drag. Doreen, on the other hand, did not smoke Galosi's or anything else, nor did she drink alcohol. Her skirts were pleated as though she played field hockey at Vassar, and her blouses were buttoned above any hint of décolletage. Doreen found it hard to look Rihanna in the eye, even though Rihanna made an exaggerated performance of trying to make Doreen feel welcome. On Doreen's first day, Rihanna seized her hand and led her down the steps to the dining room. We would not open again until dinner. It was time for the dining room staff to eat. Rihanna did not let go of Doreen's hand until Doreen had agreed to sit near the head of the table where Rihanna and Mario always sat. Rihanna was giving Doreen Sandro's seat. He shrugged and took an empty chair at the far end of the table, nearer to me, master in delight. Doreen protested. She said she would be just fine eating pap and fleece in the kitchen with the dishwasher, the salad makers, and the chefs. Doreen implored Rihanna to let her go and eat in the kitchen. Rihanna shot a look of victory at me, as if she was saying, Doreen just wants to be with her own kind. It's called community. Doreen turned to go to the kitchen. Sit down, Doreen, Rihanna commanded. This is the new South Africa. That's oh, this is hilarious. Poor Doreen, caught in the midst of a fight she didn't even want to be in. Several days later, the cash register ran out of the paper that printed receipts. Doreen leaned over the railing and asked Rihanna where the replacement spools were kept. She had looked in the cupboard under the register, but hadn't found any there. Rihanna was on the floor speaking with the Romanians. Before Rihanna could speak, Mario, who was at the bottom of the steps checking a wine order that had just been delivered, told her to look again. What happened next was over and done within 10 seconds. Mario wore soft-soled shoes that made no sound when he crossed the floor, made of redwood imported from Oregon. Doreen didn't hear him as he sprang up the steps in 3 silent bounds, nor did she see him, for she was bent over, searching the cupboard one more time. Mario came at her from behind. Surely, I thought, days later, when I still couldn't shake what had happened from my mind, she must have sensed air as it shifted behind her, a new warmth from the sudden presence of his body. He was so close to her, I thought his groin had brushed her backside. With 2 or 3 backward and forward movements, he thrust his pelvis perilously close to her. His eyes were closed orgasmically, as though pesto aromas had drifted in from the kitchen. Rihanna, Sandro, and the 2 Romanians burst out laughing. Doreen turned to find herself so close to Mario that she could have smelled his aftershave. Now his face was creased with concern. Here, he said, gently brushing her aside, let me help you. When he stood up, he said, you were right. It's not here. Where the hell is that paper, Rihanna? Okay, so they're sexually assaulting this girl up in this restaurant. I averted my eyes and slinked past Rihanna and the 2 Romanians. I headed for the kitchen. Rihanna called Mario a naughty boy. Master and Denight cleared the tables in their section in an effort to unsee what they had seen. I almost knocked Sandro down when I entered the kitchen through the wrong side of the swinging doors. Sandro sucked his teeth and shot a death stare at me as he tried to steady the tray he was carrying. Watch where you're going, I snarled. The bright lights and the bouquet of aromas in the kitchen was no refuge. For some time, Nicholas and Sifo had begun a ritual of chopping mutton or carrots or anything that could be chopped when I came into the kitchen. The sound was a chorus of guillotines. On these occasions, they didn't look at me, but I heard my neck being hacked in rhythms to the Zulu songs they sang as they cut the meat. Fana, the young dishwasher, was the only one who nodded when I came. Sibengole and Liana washed lettuce in an open sink beside him, but did not turn around. When I first began at Mario's trattoria, Nicholas and Sifo raised their voices in Inkatha war songs as they guillotined hunks of meat when I came into the kitchen. I didn't know they were war songs, nor did I know they were meant for me. But since Master's lesson in the locker room, my blood grew cold when I came into the kitchen. I heard them singing, but not this time. This time I was grateful to them. This proxy execution of the meat expatiated my guilt. What kind of coward would stand by while Mario did what he had done to Doreen? Doreen lasted all of 1 week. Toward the end of the week, she had left immediately after lunch to run some errands before evening meal. The restaurant was all but empty. I was alone in the alcove. I watched Rihanna as she sat in a chair on the landing, chatting with a woman named Fiona. Fiona and Rihanna were longtime friends from the same Klein Dorfby in the Karoo, and Fiona had also been the cashier before Doreen. Rihanna lifted the cash register in an inch and slid an envelope out from underneath. Christmas, Fiona smiled. You already gave me my back pay. It's 200 Rand, Ducky, Rihanna said. I want it back in a few days. Best if you don't know more than that. I'll explain then, promise. You're a woman of mystery, Fiona said. Rihanna lit a Galosi cigarette, exhaled, and extinguished it. Then Rihanna pecked Fiona on the cheek and bade her farewell. Okay, are they giving Doreen's money? Are they giving Doreen's money to this random white woman? Later, I saw Rihanna and Doreen by the cash register where Rihanna had pecked Fiona on the cheek. There was an adding machine between them on the table where the menus were kept and receipts from the lunch hour as well. Rihanna punched the keypad and looked up Doreen, shaking her head. Now she came down the steps. She entered the kitchen. When she came out, she was with Mario. Mario snagged a chair from the dining room on his way up the steps, and the three of them sat close together, facing each other. Rihanna spoke. Doreen's gasp was almost audible from where I was on the floor. She put her hand over her mouth. Mario shrugged with his palms to the ceiling. Rihanna put a hand on Doreen's shoulder. Now Doreen was in the alcove with me. Rihanna and Mario had remained on the landing, speaking to each other quietly. Doreen was dazed. Her eyes were moist. I gave her a glass of ice water from the tall stack of plastic crates filled with ice water glasses. I inched nearer to her. The two Romanians were singing Volare off key as they set the tables in their sections. Denight and Master were also preparing for the evening meal. They told jokes to each other in a blend of Indebile and English. They're bastards, I said, taking for granted she knew I meant Rihanna and Mario. Her voice faltered. You know, she said. Yes, I said. What are they talking about up there? Madam wants to fire me. Meneer is Afrikaans for Mr. Okay, Meneer says I should have another chance. It was just a few days ago that Doreen had felt the unease to use her first name. Now things were back to normal. Madam promises a reference with no mention of it. Now she was crying, trying not to let her sobs carry beyond the alcove. I didn't take the money. Doreen was revived by the paramedics. They had moved her from the alcove to the dining room where they ministered to her. By the way, let me say this. Feminism is BS. Feminism is BS because white women be torturing black women all the time. This is a horrible situation for this girl to be in. And so many other black women have been through BS like this, right? White people fake like something was stolen or pretend like something was broken by their black housekeepers or whatever, and then have those black people fired unjustly. Absolutely a shame. White women and feminism and all that is total BS. Absolute BS. The only type of feminism that is actually substantive and is a useful framework is black feminism, sometimes called womanism as well. But yeah, poor Doreen, and F you to this woman named Rihanna. How dare you share the name of a goddess that walks amongst us? This racist white woman, so evil, so evil. Absolutely evil, right? Anyway, I'm going to continue here. Dorina was revived by the paramedics. They had moved her from the alcove to the dining room, where they ministered to her as she lay on a stretcher. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she had not spoken since she had fainted. The side of her left hand was bandaged. She cut it on a shard of glass from the water goblets that smashed on the floor when she and I fell. One minute, she and I were standing side by side in the alcove, whispering. I told her how Rihanna had given the former cashier 200 Rand from the register. Although I had not seen Rihanna actually take the money from the cash register, I had seen her slide an envelope from underneath the register. I saw her give the envelope to Fiona, and I heard her tell Fiona it contained 200 Rand and that she, Rihanna, wanted it back in a week or so. They framed you, I told Doreen. It was a setup from the beginning. Now they can say you can't trust Africans with money, I told her. I was going to tell her that we could fight this. I was going to say I hate these people. I was going to tell her she could count on me, that I had her back, though I wasn't going to tell her why Rihanna and the Romanians laughed at her when Mario took her in a manner of speaking from behind, or how I had slinked away when I saw her hand sliding listlessly toward me along the counter where we stood. For an instant, I saw how her mouth opened, how her eyes pitched back into her skull. Her body slammed into mine. We were reeling backward now, she and I. She must have weighed 30 pounds less than me, but when she passed out, her body was a mass of dead weight that fell against me with a force twice what I weighed. I couldn't hold onto her, nor could I break her fall. We crashed into the column of water crates together. Ice and water showered us like stinging hail and rain. Her blouse was soaked, her hand was bleeding, my hair was wet and matted. I could not lift her off the floor. The sound of wet, whiskered brooms whispered in the alcove behind me as Master and Denight swept ice and broken glass. Two paramedics knelt beside Doreen. Uh, one of them stuck her with a finger prick to read her blood sugar level. Doreen's eyes were completely open now as she stared up at a fresco of faces, Rihanna, Mario, and the paramedics and me. Rihanna was asking Doreen what had happened. The paramedics with the finger prick said she fainted in a tone that suggested he thought this was obvious, but Rihanna ignored him and asked the question again. Doreen looked at me, but what did she want me to say? Did she want me to say anything? What could I say that wouldn't make matters worse? These Africans, one of the paramedics said, speaking to Doreen in the third person plural, they must eat. You hear me, sissy? Sissy, what is sissy? All these South African slangs, sister. You hear me, sissy? Your blood sugar is too low. He looked at Rihanna. That's why she fainted. Rihanna shot Mario a glance as if they knew the real reason why Doreen had passed out. It wasn't low blood sugar. I ran to the window that was pitched at street level, all that could be seen from the dining room were the shoes and the lower legs of passerbys. But the stretcher was low enough as the paramedics prepared to hoist it into the ambulance that I could see Rihanna bent low to the ground. Doreen was speaking to her now. When she finished, Rihanna nodded and stood up. The only thing I could see were Rihanna's smooth, bare legs close to the white chef's trousers that belonged to Mario. Now his legs turned and sprinted to the door. Instinctively, I backed away deeper into the dining room. From the landing, Mario yelled one word, poison. As he pounded down the stairs, he shouted, poison, poison, poison. I kept walking backwards, but he was closing on me. You spread poison everywhere. We were toe to toe. His breath was one of my breath now. I felt the mist of his saliva. Rihanna was yelling from the top of the landing, but I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Just words, isolated words in her high-pitched rage. Now I knew what she was saying. Rihanna was saying that Doreen had told them everything I had said in the alcove just before she fainted. For some reason, I had put my sunglasses on when Mario hurtled down the steps. Why, I have no idea. Now I took them off. I didn't want plastic shards embedded in my face or eyes if Mario threw a punch. My arms were so weak. It was as though the bones in my body had disappeared. I had every right to push Mario away. Rihanna was yelling that what I had told Doreen was all a lie, of course. She would sue me for slander. Mario inched closer as if that were even possible. I threw my sunglasses on the floor. The plastic frame cracked like the spine of a rat. In my peripheral vision, I saw the kitchen door swing open. Nicholas, the executive chef, and Sifo, the sous chef, slipped through, but they advanced no further than the lip of the alcove. Now Fana oozed through the door, followed by Sibongile and Liana, and two more from the kitchen crew. I wanted to ignore the stab of panic in my heart, but I couldn't. If the Zulus fight me in support of Mario, I thought, I'm dead. Even at that moment, with broken bones, arrest, prison, deportation, and death in the balance, the critic in me chided my thoughts for having let the word Zulu shimmy to the surface. It was bigoted and wrong. Not all Zulus are in Kata Freedom Party and Pippies. There are Zulus in the ANC, a voice inside admonished. Panic fought a turf war with my shame. Yeah, stop having the liberal guilt now and stand up on principles. Time to stand on business. This is the time. As a Black American, you have all the Africans watching. You're standing up against white supremacy. You're doing the right thing. Just stand on business, man, and rock with it. That's what I would say. That's what I would say, and I hope he does that. But let's find out what Frank does in this story. Every slight Mario had felt since I had started working there spewed from his lips like emerald vomit. The litany of abuses he had suffered at my hands surprised me, not because I didn't know what he was talking about or because I thought he was lying, but because I'd always assumed that only his wife, Rihanna, had the capacity to explain innuendo and subtext. I had been wrong about him. He spoke in clipped, spit-speckled bursts, a battlefield of verbs and nouns with prepositions and conjugations often triaged and left for dead. He said, I thought the patrons who dined there were my guests, not his customers. In stunning detail, he described how I swanned through his restaurant, entrancing his guests with elan, including those who not even seat in your section. You aka like this at your house. You aka like this at your house, like your name's on the door, not Mario's. Indeed, some of Mario's regulars had begun to come to the restaurant and ask for me by name. Nadine Gordimer was chief among them. She and I had hit it off the first night I met her with Reinhold. Soon she returned on her own, and we discussed literature and South African politics as I served her. She had invited me for afternoon tea, which was not tea but wine, at her house in Parktown, where she had asked me to join the ANC-aligned Congress of South African Writers. She and I would spend several months creating a series of dramatic readings by various township members of Kosa, which took place at traditionally white, high tone venues like museums and concert halls. Mario and Rihanna were no match for the charm and charisma I slathered the candlelit room with. I had learned from years and years of watching my parents at their cocktail parties how to work a room, how to compliment a white man's wife without either of them thinking it was sexual. I'd waited tables in private clubs and knew how to ask them both if they wouldn't mind if I ordered for them, followed with a guarantee that the meal was free if anything I brought them was not to their satisfaction, how to introduce an article I might have read in the newspaper about any of Mario's famous patrons without sounding like a supplicant or an autograph hound. I made them feel as though it were an honor for them to speak with me. I made them feel alive. I made them feel safe. Mario and Rihanna had the boot of apartheid pressed down on my neck, but the heel of my ego was dug into theirs. I didn't believe that this balanced the scales. Still, I loved to tell a 3-minute story to a party of his regulars and look up at the landing, at his face cracked with anguish as his guest roared with delight. I felt the satisfaction of a boy sitting cross-legged in the grass, plucking the wings off flies. Eat your homunculus heart out, Mario. This is the thing about Frank. He grew up in, uh, I would say luxury by American standards, right? Mostly all white community. Both parents were intellectuals, highly successful, upper middle class, as they would say. And so, yeah, he knows how to speak white, like talk white, as in really, really talk white. You know what I mean? Like a level, like, you know, uh, you know, sweater vest crossed over the neck white. You know what I mean? Country club white. You know, uh, private golf course white. He knows how to do that. His neighborhood had golf carts running around it. You get what I'm saying? Like he grew up in one of those areas, so he knows white folks like the back of his hand. All black people know white people better than most white people know white people, but Frank really knows white people. And so when he's hanging out with these South Africans, right, these white South Africans and other upper echelon people, he's dog walking them. Like he is able to like school them like LeBron James playing basketball with children because he knows how to swoon, you know what I mean, rub shoulders with the elites in different places. So he broke one of the laws of power, which is never upstage the master. In this case, the master being Mario. So anyway, continuing here. Specks of saliva sprinkled my face as he raged. He said I had caused Master and Denite so much pain when I pressured Rihanna to let them eat at the break table outside the kitchen. In this, he turned apartheid segregation into a healing balm that I had deprived my African brother of. But when he said he knew all about the ANC literature I thought I had so discreetly passed to members of the kitchen crew and to Master and Denite, my sense of amusement and his outpouring turned to panic. I let myself look away from him just long enough to take in what I could of Nicholas and Sifo. From their demeanors, I had no way of knowing if the two of them would enter the fray. Mario told me to take back what I had told Doreen about Rihanna, that she stole the money to frame Doreen. He demanded that I tell everyone in the dining room that it was a lie. The problem was this: no one but Mario and Rihanna knew that I had said to Doreen because she made her confession outside, right before the paramedics slid the stretcher into the ambulance. My silence enraged him. He told me it was one thing for me to disrespect him, but quite another for me to disrespect his wife. He gave me one more chance to apologize. Instead, I turned to face Master, Denite, Sibongile, Liana, Fana, Nicholas, and Sifo. Like a record spinning at 78 RPMs, I told them Rihanna stole 200 Rand from the till and hid the money in an envelope under the till. Then Rihanna made a show of helping Doreen balance the till. I said as fast as I could, but the fix was in. That's when Mario slugged me. He's standing on business. I salute this. Beautiful Black American pride, standing up against white supremacy no matter where we go. We are a proud, beautiful people, brave people. I love it. Shout out to Frank, man. Big G, big gangster. Anyway, from the landing, Rihanna was screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled at Mario to stop fighting. When a glass broke or a dish landed on the floor, she became even more animated, as though the well-being of the tableware were what was at stake. What kind of American are you? If she only knew that I didn't know. If anything, as comprehensive as a thought entered my mind as Mario charged at me like a bull, headbutting me with the solar plexus. It was the irony of her question. Rihanna's shrill scream shredded the air like shrapnel. Mario drove his head into my stomach and drove me back into the railing just below where Rihanna stood. Mario was shorter than his wife, Rihanna, a 5'7" former Stoffbach. What is a Stoffbach? South African for Dust Bowl. A Dust Bowl beauty queen. What's a Dust Bowl beauty queen? Anyway, I was 3 inches taller than her. I had thought that it would be easier to fight a short man than a tall one. I was wrong. His low center of gravity gave him an advantage as he drilled his forehead into my torso and pinned me to the railing. I pummeled his ribs with a pendulum of blows, but he kept holding on. He caught me with an uppercut to the chin. I felt my bottom teeth cut the inside of my lip. Blood beetled down my chin. One of the Romanians got into the mix. He was a thin coat hanger of a man with the eyes of a startled squirrel. He grabbed my arm and tried to pull me off Mario. I tossed his narrow ass like salad. The edge of a table spiked his back. He grimaced in pain and drunk walked to the alcove, groping his back. Mario pulled me down from behind and we fell to wrestling. He rolled on the floor in each other's. We rolled on the floor in each other's arms. Two panda bears making love. Our brawl lacked the bull-stunning fisticuffs, the flying chairs of an action film. No denouement decided the winner. Man, sounds like you got your ass beat by that midget. Sorry. We are both on our feet now. Sandro, not Mario, is in tears and standing between us. Rihanna tells me Black Americans have dined at Mario's and none of them were like me. They're clever and civilized, she is saying. Mario is pointing his finger in my face from behind Sandro's back, telling me I'm fired. I'm fired, I reply when you put it. I'm fired, I reply when you put it in writing. He says, fuck you. I'm not writing you shit. 18. Our flat was on the corner of Amersfoort Street and Jan Smuts Avenue, a 5-minute walk from Mario's. Ribone, Kanye's older sister, was in the living room when I walked in. My bloody lip, my knuckles, my ribs, and my pride were too bruised for me to register the meaning of Ribone's presence. She was in Joburg, not in Mbato, under house arrest, almost 200 miles away. Did this mean that the police had captured her lover, the insurgent in the Tanzanian People's Liberation Army? Kanye was seated next to her on the sofa. A tray of tea and scones were on the table in front of them. My shirt was torn. My bow tie was God knows where. I was so ashamed of the way I kept crying. I shook and snorted like a freezing horse. Kanye and Ribone begged me to tell them what had happened. I couldn't speak. Something large and empty, like the belch of a walrus, burst in my chest. I'm going. Again, nothing came but convulsive sobs. I looked at the ceiling. I'm going to kill that white man. Ribone raced to the double doors that opened onto the balcony and closed them. Only in his absence was I aware of the ambient sound from the street below, the scat of horns and laughter swathed in silence now. I said it again. I'm going to kill that white man, Ribone said, something she had never done before. She snapped her fingers at Kanye. Then she pointed at me. It broke the trance Kanye was in. She was beside me now. Her palm bore down on my mouth as I tried to say it again. Her hand clasped my jaw with a strength I had never felt from her in the 3 years that we had been together. Ribone bolted the front door. In the bedroom, Kanya had me stripped down to my drawers. It was almost comical. The way she drew the covers over me so high, they almost hid my head. I couldn't talk without crying now. I told her everything. She listened with neither surprise nor disbelief. This is South Africa, she said. Then Kanya closed the curtains and the room dropped into darkness. She took my clothes and upon leaving the bedroom, she said, "You'll get another job." The room was so dark when I awoke that I thought it was the middle of the night. I panicked. The clock on the sideboard said 3:53, and I wondered what Kanya was doing out of bed at this hour of the morning. Then I saw a long blister of light where the curtains came together. I went to the closet and put on a new white shirt with a collar and black pants. I won't go down like this. Hell fucking no. Okay. Don't try to get your job back, man. Just take the L. Kanya pleaded with me not to go back to work the dinner shift at Mario's. With her iron fist and a velvet glove voice, the same voice she had used to give directions to her younger sister, Ribone said, "There's no habeas corpus here. You'll just be disappeared." When I walked through the front door, Rihanna scampered down the steps ahead of me and disappeared into the kitchen. She running. She came out with her husband in tow. They watched me from the alcove. My intestines roiled. My chest clenched. I tried to ignore them as I set the tables. Now Mario was upon me. "Didn't I fire you?" Rihanna hurried up the landing and dialed the telephone. Mario's older brother, Angelo, entered the restaurant and was solemnly greeted by his sister-in-law and Mario. The three of them spoke in hushed tones on the landing. In a voice meant to be heard by them, Master said I was setting the tables all wrong. This gave him an excuse to come to my table. In that grandfather's voice of his, he admonished me as he pretended to rearrange my table setting. Antipasto, soup, pasta, entree, and then the salad fork, he said, as he laid the cutlery. Now he whispered, he's not a violent man, referring to Angelo. Was my fear that transparent? I replied, they're going to take me out back and beat the shit out of me. The only thing I didn't know was if Nicholas and Sifo would join them. Would it be 2-on-1 or 4-on-1? In Mario's office, a baseball bat leaned against a chipped filing cabinet. It was a cramped utility room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and on the wall a calendar of nude women on top of cars. My first inkling that Angelo was running the show came when I saw Mario seated not behind his own desk, but in one of the two chairs meant for visitors. His older brother, Angelo, sat behind his desk. Now Angelo rolled Mario's chair from behind the desk and sat on it next to Mario. The chairs had been arranged so that when we sat down on our knees, our knees almost touched. Unlike Mario, Angelo never raised his voice. He let Mario yell his poison mantra and report all the lies I had spread without so much as a twitch. He looked at me even when Mario spoke, and I never saw him blink. Finally, he silenced us both by holding up his hand. You came to this country with a 6-month tourist visa, am I right? He said. I didn't answer. You had no money, no work permit, fresh off the boat. You think that we don't understand? We understand. The same was true for us. We could be brothers. The thought of the three of us as brothers didn't seem to sit well with Mario. He frowned. Angelo nodded towards Mario. So, here, your brother hires you right off the boat. Am I right? He asks you for papers. No, he says. Where are your references? No, you walk in off the street. My brother doesn't know you from any other paisano in the street, does he? But he gives you a job. And how do you repay him? He sat back and laced his hands across his stomach as if we were somewhere other than a moldy utility room with a baseball bat in the corner. Then he said, I sowed dissent and spread lies, trying to turn the kitchen against his brother, accusing his sister-in-law of stealing just a firewoman that she herself had hired. We're at the end of our rope, my friend, Angelo informed me. You're going to have to leave. No, do not shake your head. Do not shake your head. You're going to leave now, paisano. No, Angelo, Mario insisted. We open in 20 minutes. We need to, Angelo said. Quiet, Mario. He's busting our balls, Mario cried. We didn't come all the way from Napoli to have our balls busted by some. Angelo cut him off with a look before he could say the word. But I would have traded Angelo's death stare to be called the N-word by Mario. Now Angelo changed his tone. He spoke to me with the tenor of someone offering me a job rather than giving me the boot. What's it going to take, huh? Tell me. I want it in writing, I said. I'm not disputing your right to fire me, but I need it in writing. You have to say why. Angelo leaned in so close to me that for an instant our knees touched. I heard the faint sound of air funneling in and out of his nostrils. He tapped his finger on my knee. A low voltage current jagged up my thigh to my heart. I hated myself for not slapping him into next week. As Angelo tapped me, he said, in what can only be described as a whisper, you're going to leave our friends in La Costa. You're going to leave, or our friends in La Cosa Nostra will break your kneecaps. When Angelo finished telling me how long I would be in traction in the hospital after the mafia busted my knees, 6 weeks before I could stand, 6 weeks of physical therapy, a hobbled existence even after I walked, he said, what's it to be, door number 1 or door number 2? Run, a voice inside me was saying, run. Fine, I said. Angelo smiled and leaned back in his chair. He extended his hand to me and said, no hard feelings? You get the mafia to bust my kneecaps and I'll get conto here. Conto we squeeze to bust yours and Mario's. I could feel the sweat pasting my shirts to my underarms. We might be in the same hospital if it's multiracial, but I'll use my time of recovery to write op-ed pieces about how bloody racist this place is. Maybe get Monsiwa Moroke of the Star to do an expose. Do you know his byline? Of course not. You don't read. I wanted to tap his kneecap with my index finger, but my hands were moist with perspiration. He would know I was bluffing. Then I said, wait till your regulars like Nadine Gordimer read this. Did you know she's a member of the the ANC? No, you don't even know where you are. This is South Africa. You're surrounded. 15 million of you, 40 million of us. You're surrounded. Wait till it spreads from Mario's restaurant to your string of beauty parlors. How many white women from Parktown are going to jostle through a throng of picketing Africans just to get their hair done at your salons? Did you know that Nadine Gordimer lives in Parktown? No, you didn't even know who she was. After a beat, I asked if we were finished. Angela snorted. I left without turning my back to them. In the hallway, I heard the scamper of work shoes on the concrete floor. When I turned at the corner where the alcove was, I saw the kitchen door sway lazily. Someone from the kitchen had been listening outside Mario's office. In the dining room, the Romanians and Rihanna looked at me as though they were seeing the second coming of the mummy. Rihanna turned the outdoor lights on, removed the close sign, and unlocked the front door. When she turned her back, I hurried to the men's room. I wanted to use the farthest stall in case an early guest came in, but I wouldn't make it that far. I dropped to my knees, held onto the toilet seat as though it was a life preserver, and I retched so hard I stripped mined the walls of my stomach. I washed my face and wondered when the mirror would stop quivering my lips. Don't you cry, said the twisted prune in the mirror. Don't you fucking cry. That's meant hardcore. This is hardcore. See, this is the life of a revolutionary, of a fighter, right? Like you stand strong in public, but in the backstage you break down. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that doesn't make you a coward. Shout out to Frank here. This is a gangsta ass story. So the black people who worked at Mario's had little in common politically. Master and Tonight kept their politics to themselves, as did most of South Africa's 35 million black people when they were at work. This was also true of Sibongile and Liana. Nicholas and Sifo were IFP members, sworn enemies of the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or COSATU. Fana, the dishwasher, was a dedicated comrade. All of these differences mattered in important ways. None of them mattered in ways that were essential. We were all positioned in the same place paradigmatically. We were all, in other words, the antithesis of the human. We were all implements on Mario and Rihanna's plantation. From the Arab slave trade, which began in AD 625, through its European incarnation beginning in 1452, everyone south of the Sahara had to negotiate captivity. At a global level of abstraction, we can see how Africa has been carcerally contained by the rest of the world for more than 1,000 years. There's no habeas corpus here. Captivity overdetermined the condition of possibility for everyone's life. How people performed on a carceral continent was as varied as the choices made by us at Mario's. Some fled the coast and trekked deeper into the interior to avoid notice and, with any luck, capture. The way Denight kept to the corners of the restaurant where no one was likely to speak with him when he wasn't serving his tables. Some made themselves indispensable for as long as possible to the white slavers by becoming slave hunters, like Nicholas and Sifo, and Impipis of the Inkatha Freedom Party. Some wore their prowess and pride on their sleeves and lashed out without a plan or foresight. Like me, some confided in the mistress in the hope, perhaps, of attaining some form of sanctuary or for reasons they themselves could not fathom, like Doreen. The essential Afro-pessimist point rests not in moral judgment of the choices they made, but in an ethical assessment of the common dilemmas they all shared. The question that haunts the slave's first waking moments: what will these white people do to my flesh today? How deep will they cut? Some were captured and refused to live. Some sent their children to a different death, as in Beloved. The dreams of all these different captives could not be reconciled, but their place in the paradigm was the same. They woke up each morning with a deeper anxiety than the proletariat, the worker. The proletariat wakes up in the morning wondering, how much will I have to do today and how long will I have to do it? Exploitation and alienation morphed into an early morning ulcer. How much will the capitalist demand of me and how long will I have to do it? Again, the slave wakes up in the morning wondering, what will these humans do to my flesh? A hydraulics of anxiety that is very different than exploitation and alienation. If a can of tuna or a bucket of nails could speak, their essential questions would not revolve around how their labor power is being exploited or how they are alienated from the value that they produce. Exploitation and alienation are not the grammar of their suffering. How can one exploit and implement? And the value that a tool helps produce never accrued to the tool. For the slave, the implement, exploitation, and alienation are trumped by accumulation and fungibility. products themselves are consumed, not their labor power. Slaves are implements, not workers. What Marx called speaking implements, Mario and Rihanna speaking implements. Interesting. That's a powerful sentence. Our response to captivity was as varied as the myriad choices that our ancestors made hundreds of years ago on that continent. But the question was the same: what will these white people do to my flesh? And the answer is the same: anything they want. There is no habeas corpus here, Ribone warned. She didn't know how right she was. For black people, there is no habeas corpus anywhere. Doreen knew this better than any of us. She negotiated her captivity by fainting, her unconscious attempt to save herself by throwing herself overboard. When she came to, she was staring up into the faces of all her masters and me, a fellow slave. Freelance pallbearers took her body to the ambulance. She would live when what she really may have wanted was to follow death into freedom, to jump ship before it docked. Who wouldn't tell them what they wanted to hear? There's no habeas corpus here. Doreen and the rest of us lived, if lived is the word, in a paradigm of violence that bore no analogy to the violence of exploitation and alienation suffered by the worker. Doreen was the first Black person specifically fired and officially sanctioned to handle money with her Black hands. White South Africans had hired her to break their libidinal laws, to violate the mainstays of their collective unconscious. Then some trickster in the alcove whispers in her ear that her intuition had not let her think out loud, that it was all a setup. The Black people who worked at Mario's were different ages, ethnicities, and genders, but these differences at the level of identity did not alter our sameness at the level of position. One does not position oneself in the world. One is born into a name that's been chosen. Perhaps there was a moment of solidarity sparked by a common acknowledgement of our common position within social death. If there was such a moment, it was splintered. The stern way Master schooled me in the locker room and the flickers of kindness he showed in the tensest situations, gestures that put his wife and his children in venda, to whom he sent money each month at risk. The way Nicholas and Sifo did not hurt me, or worse, when they had the chance, a deed for which they would have been exonerated and rewarded. Yeah, so this is something that I've thought about before. If I hadn't said it publicly, basically all Black people living in in this white supremacist existence, have the same questions. Why is this situation like this, and what can I do to make it better for myself, if not change it? Those are the two questions every Black person asks when they become sentient in this world. How did we get like this, and what can I do to change it? And people come up with various different answers. Candace Owens and Simon Hill Keeps It Trill ask those same two basic questions and come up with different answers, right? So that's what I essentially get from what he is saying here. I finally quit Mario's in late June and early winter when one could be stopped without warning by a midday rain. I said my warm goodbyes to Master and to Night. Rihanna blew the smoke of Galoisi cigarettes to the side and wished me all the best. The Romanians and Sandro nodded. To my surprise, Mario shook my hand. Had I really been here for the better part of 6 months, I thought? Outside, the rain drummed the awning and laid siege to the front door. I'd left my umbrella at home. I didn't want to run a quarter of a mile in this weather, but nor could I endure the awkwardness of being in Mario's once I said my goodbyes. Then I remembered I had not said goodbye to Fana, the dishwasher, or to Sibongile and Liana, the two women who made salads and buttered warm garlic bread. It's just the decent thing to do, I thought. But it also meant facing Nicholas and Sifo, two Inkatha supporters, if not outright Impipis. A chill ran over my flesh at the memory of my having pressed MK pamphlets in Nicholas and Sifo's hands. A bigger fool had never been born. I told myself that I didn't owe Sibongile, Liana, and Fana goodbyes. They weren't my friends. We worked together. I should leave out the front door and forget this place, but I knew that I was lying to myself. I was simply afraid of encountering the Zulus, whom I still feared, and most of all, whom I made a fool of myself to without knowing I'd done so. I looked at the clock and realized that it should be safe to go into the kitchen. Nicholas and Sifo would be long gone. Sibongile, Liana, and Fana might be there cleaning up. Out the door, I heard the sound of butcher knives melting through mutton and thumping the block. It matched the thumping in my heart. It was Fana, Sibongile, and Liana who were gone. Nicholas and Sifo had their backs to me. I turned to leave before they saw me. Frank, too late. They had traces of mutton blood on their hands and aprons. They stood together at the butcher block table. They still had their knives in their hands. I thought of the story Master had told me about how Nicholas had chased Fauna around the room with the knife, telling Fauna he would meet his mother if he was caught with more of Frank's pamphlets and books. Nicholas put his knife down and wiped his hand on a towel. "We heard you're leaving," he said. Sifo said nothing. Yes, yes, lunch was my last shift. To do what? Nicholas insisted. Well, I teach at WITS. That's why I'm not here on Mondays. And I teach creative writing there at night. But those jobs are over now. I have a more permanent teaching position somewhere else. Teaching what? It's like English, I lied. In point of fact, I was hired to be the second in charge of an NGO project working with township organizers, the very people who were fighting in Kata. For the next year, I would write training material and facilitate workshops for civic leaders from the Black townships surrounding Johannesburg. The workshops were on everything from strategic planning for grassroots social movements, the theory of civil society elaborated by the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, political organizing, office work, and division of labor, and writing. But I couldn't say this to them. The civics were the township's version of the Paris Commune, organs of people's power aligned with the ANC. Nicholas's eyes lit up. Sifo nodded to him as though he'd won a bet. That's why you speak perfect English, Nicholas said. Fellas, there's no such thing as perfect English. That's a racist myth. In fact, you speak it like the whites, Sifo said, as though that settled it. You must teach me in China, Nicholas implored. I asked Mario to wait tables. He says my English is bad. I would scare the customers. He said my head is wood. Oh, so sad. Um, Anyway, as Nicholas spoke, my compassion for him grew, which confused me. This man is a state lackey. What am I doing talking to him? Have some sympathy, Frank. Come on now. I want to be clever like you, but I don't have my standard four. You held my life in abeyance for 4 months without my knowing it. I'd say that's pretty clever. For a better understanding of the civics and the role they played in the struggle, see Mwanzele Mkiche, Patrick Bond, Township Politics, Civil Struggle for New South Africa. Okay, that's a book right there. But anyway, the character of the encounter was so contrary to anything I could have imagined. For a wet afternoon alone with these two in a cold cave-like kitchen that I was tongue-tied. I rattled something non-committal, like WITS has a school for workers, and then again, there's the workers' library. And well, of course, I'd love to teach you, but we'll have to get together and work out the time and place. And of course, you can come by my office anytime, and we can see if. But then again, I'm rarely in my office, but I'm sure we can work something out. I can't recall an encounter in which I've been that baffled, afraid, and ashamed. Nicholas spread his fingers on the butcher block and said, I'll miss you, Frank. For months, ever since I had learned that he was a member of the IFP, I had wanted to feel hatred for him and Sifo, hatred towards them for the hundreds of people per month that their cohorts and maybe even they themselves had hacked to pieces, shot to death, and burned alive. I walked gingerly over to the butcher block and shook both their hands. I'll miss both of you as well. Then I turned my back on them without the dread of days gone by. I looked down from the landing at the silent dining room. I had heard the blue wail of sound ascending, all the candlelit faces singing Valere for the last time. Beautiful chapter, very interesting story. Yeah, man. I mean, going to Africa, like God, anytime Black Americans go to Africa, if you're woke, you'll get fucked up, man. And it sounds like Frank had a fucked up Africa experience, similar to me. You know, my Tanzania and Kenya adventures and Tunisia adventures. Yeah, Africa will fuck you up, bro. It really will. Anyway, let's continue here to the epilogue. Epilogue, the new century. So, the new century, the term nervous breakdown is sometimes used by people to describe a stressful situation in which they're temporarily unable to function normally in day-to-day life. If you have a primary care provider, talk to him or her about your signs and symptoms or seek help from a mental health professional. Dania K. Hall Falvin, medical doctor. That's good advice right there, right? They cannot love themselves as Black, but are made to hate themselves as white. What do you do with an unconscious that appears to hate you? David Marriott. Oh, that's profound advice. That's a profound comment, sir. To the final chapter we go. Part 1. Elsewhere, I have written about the dissolution of the revolution in South Africa after Chris Hani, the chief of staff of MK, was assassinated, how Nelson Mandela's moderates consolidated power and purged the ANC of its most prominent revolutionaries, such as Winnie Mandela, how Kanye and I parted, how President Mandela's intelligence czar put my name on a list of ultra-leftists to be neutralized. I won't rehearse that here. Toward the end of 1996, I returned to America, the plantation of my birth. In Compton, where I worked as a substitute teacher in grade school, middle schools, and high schools, I was gobsmacked to see the police using tactics on Black children that I thought I left behind in the schools of Soweto. The next year, I went north to Berkeley to get a PhD, and equilibrium seemed to return to my life. But the year 2000 came, and on one day, I cracked. In the 19 years since my breakdown, I have not been able to pinpoint the cause. One day, I was attending seminars and political rallies. The next day, I was groaning on a gurney in the student health psych ward. The absence of an origin story unnerves me to this day. The doctor and the nurse at the UC Berkeley clinic pressed me for answers. What brought this on? How did I get to the clinic? And if they released me, how would I get home? They peered at my car keys in my hand as though it were a dangerous weapon in the hands of a child. I shook my head and told them I had taken the bus. Okay, now the book, as it's ending, is coming full circle, because if I remember right, in the first chapter, he had this medical emergency and he's laying down on the gurney in like the ambulance, and like he has this faint consciousness where he remembers seeing the white folks' faces that are trying to save him, like have this care in their eyes and this desire to want to help him. But then when he comes back alive, when he's fully awake, right, the white folks look at him in complete terror and disgust, right? And yeah, I spoke about that when we read the first chapter. So now I think the book is coming full circle, but let's find out. So now the pain was not in my heart, but also in my rib cage, in my arms. If the antagonism was not between the haves and the have-nots, as Marx had claimed, nor between the man and the woman, or the gay and the straight, as I had learned in my graduate seminar on psychoanalysis, but if the essential antagonism was instead between the Black and all others, then to free the world was to free the world of me. For Halloween, I washed my face and wore my school clothes and went to door as a nightmare. When I left my apartment to come here, I had looked down the 7 steps from my door to the street as though I was staring into a ravine. I thought I would pass out. My Honda Civic dozed at the curb like a blue sleeping lizard. My keys had scratched the wrought iron railing as I stumbled down the steps. Threads of saliva spooled on the hood of my car. Somebody help me, I groaned, but I didn't want my neighbors to see me like this, let alone come to my aid. My neighbors in Berkeley, like my neighbors in Kenwood, were white. It would take 10 reincarnations to free me from their debt. You don't want to owe them, something deep within me had said. But how could I explain all of that to this doctor and this nurse? I told them the truth, that I took the bus there, but I didn't tell them why. Make them feel safe. They sent me home from the UC Berkeley clinic with pills, SSRIs, which sound like a branch of the military, when in point fact, it stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, uppers for depression, and chlordiazepam, which I was pleased to hear was a rare form of leprosy, but a pill for panic attacks. We normally don't describe antidepressants and anti-panic drugs together, the doctor confessed, as though gilding his conscience by being upfront with me. For several weeks after I left the clinic, I sought Black therapists, thinking they could help me best. They were no saner than me, which is not to say that they were falling apart. They were saner than me, which is not to say that, like me, they were falling apart. For the most part, these therapists reminded me of my parents, who were both psychologists, sharp as tic-tac-toe. They cared like none of the white therapists I had sampled cared. A mind is a terrible thing to waste kind of care. What is that slogan from the United Negro College Fund ad campaign launched in 1972? Okay. So a mind is a terrible thing to waste kind of care. Without realizing it, we worked hard together in order to help me solve all the problems I wasn't having, to lead me from the gully of despair, and to keep me from going crazy again. But I hadn't gone crazy. Many people do go crazy, and many of them are not healed, but none of them are Black. One can go crazy only if one has been sane. The time of sanity is not a temporality that the slave has ever known. Let's repeat that. One can go crazy only if one has been sane. The time of sanity is not a temporality that the slave has ever known. So essentially, being being black in this white supremacist world, in the Afro-pessimist worldview, is a time of complete insanity. So, yeah, going crazy would be impossible if everything around you is already crazy. Like saying a fish gets more wet, I think is a better way of putting it. To a fleeting eye, their madness looks like mine. They go crazy from the pressure of racism, sexism, homophobia, and colonial rule. The external forces of aggression become too much for them, and they too find themselves being gaped at on a gurney. But their tensions are bundled in the question: how does it feel to have a problem? My tensions, and those of the black therapists who tried to heal me, are bundled in the question: how does it feel to be a problem? There's no analogy between having and being. Every story of despair has a 3 point progression: equilibrium, the status of the mind of free psychic trauma; disequilibrium, the intrusion of a wounding trauma, which indeed all but destroys equilibrium; equilibrium restored, renewed, or reimagined, the therapeutic cure in psychology, or the end of analysis in psychoanalysis. But if the mind has never known the first point of that progression, if madness, even low grade and as yet unexpressed madness, is your status quo, then time stands still, for you cannot possess your own image as your ego ideal. You cannot love yourself as black, but are made to hate yourself as white. And it is the word made that throws a wrench in the works of recovery. For your self hatred is the product not of your personal neurosis, but of violence so vast it birthed your other, the human being. If the talking cure is a cure for humans, what is your cure? You are not the subject of your own redemption. You are, as Cecilio M. Cooper explains, a vector through which others can accomplish themselves. You marry white, it doesn't change. You change your slave name. You turn your white Jesus to the wall. It doesn't change. You marry black. It still doesn't change. For it to stop, it would have to have started. You go through life not knowing your desire for theirs. Like a man being lynched and forced to eat his severed penis while telling the lynchers, lording over him how good it tastes, you see yourself as a phobic object in need of self-destruction for someone else's safety. That someone else is you, but also not you. What do you do with an unconscious that appears to hate you? After reading David Marriott's On Black Men, the word appears crushed my skull like an elephant's foot. Some days, the weight kept me from getting out of bed. On one such day, I was slumped on the floor beside my bed. My first class had already started, but that word appears had its foot on my neck. Did it mean that my unconscious hates me every time it comes into view? That to glimpse my unconscious is to glimpse the desire for my own destruction? Or did appear suggest doubt, as though my unconscious only seemed to hate me? The quandary made it hard for me to move my body, to rise from the floor and get dressed for my seminar. For if self-hatred was a constitutive element of my unconscious, then the talking cure of psychoanalysis, and most certainly of therapy, was no more than a high-grade snake oil. The black was a static image of abjection, but this stasis was productive for the human. Against black abjection, humans could know themselves as agents of change as well as agents who could change. A Marxist like me, I told myself at the time, can't believe this. But several months into the 21st century, a Sacramento lawyer who co-authored Proposition 29 let me know that I was wrong. I woke up in the morning with that phone call on my mind. I had been doing political organizing in the San Francisco Bay Area to persuade people to vote against Proposition 29. If I remember right, Prop 29 was I'm not from California, and that was like early 2000s. I think that was the one about legalizing gay marriage in California. I think that's what Proposition 29 was about, legalizing gay marriage in California. Keep in mind, this is like the year 2000 or 2001, and gay marriage would not be legal all across the country till like 2009 or 10, if I remember right. So yeah, that's what I think uh, to vote against Proposition 21. Either Prop 21 was that, or it was something about illegal immigration. It's one of those, but it was one of those. So if he's saying, yeah, it's one of those. I think he'll explain it here. I had called a lawyer in Sacramento who was a member of the inner circle of lawyers at the state capitol who had authored the proposition. Under Prop 21, many children as young as 14 years of age charged with committing felonies would no longer be eligible for juvenile court, and prosecutors will be allowed to directly file charges against juvenile offenders in adult court without having to get the permission of juvenile court. Okay, yep, I was totally wrong. I was totally wrong. I forgot wrong. Prop 21 had nothing to do with gay marriage or immigrants. It was about charging children as adults in California courts. Okay. I could not believe any rational person would want to send a child to a place like San Quentin. A lawyer, I thought, was a rational being. When he answered, I told him my name was J. Walljasper, a prominent left-wing activist and journalist. This was the test. If he knew the name, the jig was up, but he didn't know the name. So I compounded the lie by saying that I was a freelance reporter for William F. Buckley's National Review. As a stockbroker, I've been trained to feel smiling vibrations in the voices of people I cold called. I could feel this Sacramento lawyer was grinning ear to ear. I congratulated him and people like him across the country who were putting propositions on state ballots to crack down on juvenile crime. Proposition 21, I beamed, was a trailblazer. I had every bit of confidence that the National Review would accept my story because the editors there, as incensed with this pandemic as he and his colleagues were, I had to be a good journalist, however, and ask him some difficult questions. He told me he understood. The law, if passed, I reminded him, would also let prosecutors and judges decide if a child of 14 could be tried as an adult for a felony. That's not a problem for most people in California, I continued. But the touchy-feely liberals of the Bay Area will say the guidelines for sending children to adult court and then to San Quentin or Folsom are just veiled strategies for instructing prosecutors and judges on how to weed kids who are Black from those who aren't. The silence on his end of the line was too long. For a moment, I thought he knew what I was up to, which would put him 2 steps ahead of me, because I did not know what exactly I was up to. But when he spoke, he asked me if I had any children. So the game wasn't up. We were still talking white to white. My daughter is 13, I confessed, without also saying she's a beautiful South African girl with glowing onyx skin and almond eyes and a hint of mischief in her smile. I have 2 boys, he said. He then said that he and I both knew something. I started to sweat. I didn't know what he and I knew. We knew that our children are not those children. Those children are animals. We are, he informed me, categorically not sending 14-year-old children to San Quentin. We're sending animals to San Quentin. I was so dazed that when he said, "It's been a pleasure, Mr. Walljasper," I didn't know whom he meant. A new century had begun, but nothing essential had changed. White folks stay on code. White folks stay on code. And they don't even have to say it. They just say, "You know, brother, you know. Talk to you later, buddy. All right, bye." Anyway, I sat on the floor of my Berkeley apartment with no will to move. A riot of memories ransacked my brain, from Selena Davenport's interrogation, "How does it feel to be a Negro?" to Samir Bashar's reverie, "The shame and humiliation runs even deeper if the Israeli soldier is an Ethiopian Jew," to Rihanna's question, "What kind of American are you?" to the man I had just spoken with on the phone, with whom I had condemned my own child. Our children are not those children. "Mom, you once called me a glutton for punishment, said I'd rather beat up someone's fist with my face than find a way to live in harmony. Well, here I am, my flesh in bits and pieces, hoisted by my own petard. The cold part about my phone call with my lawyer is that the lawyer wasn't just talking about the super predator that Hillary Clinton alluded to. He was talking about the women who gave birth to them, the reproductive labor of Black women who give birth he was talking about the women who give birth to them, the reproductive labor of Black women who give birth to beings that are not human. I am floored by what he said about you. Did he not know how you nurtured the children of Kenwood as their mothers cannibalized yours? Had you done to Elgar Davenport what his mother, Selena Davenport, did to me, those mothers would have shown you no mercy. Mom, not only did you not treat their children as fodder in a proxy war, but their memories of you are often fonder than their memories of the women who gave birth to them. women without half your education and not a trace of your compassion, 3 coins in a fountain ingenues who stewed their minds in martinis, women who never lectured on early childhood development in China and Germany, only to come back to the States and be called gal in Macy's, women who could not conceive of the roads you traveled, and as when you and dad pierced the jungles of Belize to post bail for study abroad students being held in a mud and metal jail. Women who, well into their 40s, stayed free, white, and 21. They worked crossroads in their pearls. They could hurt you through your child, but all their children loved you. You showed Elgar Davenport that a mother's love was more than Selena Davenport's smoke rings and ridicule. The extra scoop of ice cream that he couldn't get at home, the reassurance that his weight and his wandering eye and the Coke bottle glasses did not make him a freak. You're your own kind of special, Elgar, like any child, you told him. All my friends felt at home with you. Well into adulthood, they recalled how you folded newspapers into gunboat hats that you painted red, white, and blue on the 4th of July, and the way you cheered them on and lit their sparklers as they marched up the hill past our house. You made them feel loved. You made them feel safe, as their own mothers twisted your stomach into knots, as a scrum of lawyers wrote your children and your children's children into the criminal code. Give me one good reason, Mom, why you think I should get up and go to class. I fought battles in South Africa that I wasn't sure I would live through. But had I died in South Africa, I would have at least died with the illusion that I had died a human death, a worker's death, a death of universal meaning. I wish I had died there, Mom. How can I go on without that illusion? There's only one way, but it's a million miles over rough terrain from the floor beside my bed to the medicine cabinet with the pills I need to freeze dry my pain. When I was feeling low down as a boy, you didn't give me psychotropic drugs. Instead, you told me you're of good Louisiana stock and you have a strong mind. Hey, wow, Louisiana, we in this big. Wow, yeah. I told you. I keep telling y'all, man. I keep telling y'all. Anyway. I'm sorry. I'm immune to that tonic now. When did your wisdom stop working for me? When did you and I grow so far apart? It must have been in 1968 when your mother and I cheered the looters on TV in the days after King was killed. It must have been that summer when birds straffed the sun like a fist of pepper in the last good eye of God, and you sliced through a crowd of rusty butt boys to stop Luke from bleeding Reg. Do you remember that hang-dog look I gave you all summer after you saved that white man's life? Surely you recall how I got my revenge despite the fact that I was only 12 years old. My mother was at the kitchen table making flashcards of French verbs. Dad stood at the stove making roux for gumbo. With the reverence of a choir boy, I entered the kitchen. Mommy, I want to go to Vietnam, I said as piously as I knew how at the age of 12. Whatever for, she asked. My father, who had not a cunning bone in his body, didn't know that I saw the don't look a gift horse in the mouth glance he exchanged with her. I want to do my part, I said. She was pleased and worried at once. She didn't like war, but she was a patriot and she wanted me to be one too. It was too good to be true. Her darling boy had returned to her without the help of an exorcist. She touched my cheek the way she used to do when I lay on the living room floor in Minneapolis, imbibing her choir's Gregorian chants. She said the war could be over when I turned 16, but you can join the Coast Guard, Dad offered as the roux thickened. Or the Peace Corps, she added. Then she told me how, before I was born, her bags were packed and her plane ticket was in hand. She was going to Guam to live and teach English for a program not unlike the Peace Corps when my father asked her to marry him. The rest, Mom said with a chuckle, is history. The rest is you, son. I let the two of them bask in the glow of our reconciliation. Then I said, you don't understand me. I didn't mean the white man's army. I meant the Viet Cong. Big gangster. I love it. I love that. I do you. Son, yeah, son, if my son tells me something like that, I'm going to cry. I'm going to cry. I'm gonna drop a little tear. I want to go to Vietnam. Aw, well, maybe you can join the Coast Guard or the Marines. No, I want to join the Viet Cong. There we go. There we go. That's hard. Anyway, and so it began. Our decades of strike and counterstrike, a mother-child dyad that took no prisoners. Have you voted for Obama? She said 40 years later. You know, the polls are closing in California. I voted for Mandela in 1994. One milquetoast Negro is enough. Ouch. Okay. I know my mama hate me for not voting Democrat down ticket. I vote third party, left-wing third party, party for socialism and liberation and communism and gulags. Yeah, those are the parties I vote for. Anyway. How will you explain it to your daughter, my granddaughter, if you miss this historic moment? Your daddy wasn't no fool. Sarcasm is the laugh refuge of the weak, son. Would you hold a ticket tape parade for the first black man to drop an atomic bomb? Your point being, what's a U.S. president? That's my point. Frank, when will you say something good about this country instead of tearing it down when it's no longer this country? Where's your Christian forgiveness? I'm a communist. Jesus sends me hate mail. Ha! I love this. The mother-son dynamic. When I lived in New York and studied at Columbia, when I lived in South Africa and fought against apartheid, when I went to Berkeley to earn a PhD, and even when I finally left and became a professor in Southern California, I was always glad to be on the other side of the world or across the continent where I could be free of your patriotism, your debutante balls, your ladies auxiliary of the Knights of Columbus, your Jack and Jill conventions, your God. When I was 15, I moved to the attic where I could smoke weed undetected, read Mao and Fanon, and make believe all the cretins on the floors below were no kin of mine. Not once in 40 years did I say I love you, nor did I hear it from you. But you saved my life when I was in 5th grade. Kenwood Elementary School had crushed my resolve like an anvil dropped from a great height. My only sanctuary was the cold, clammy bed I wet so many nights. At first, you counseled me the way you counseled your clients in your private practice, but I was too depressed for words. Then when they told you they would hold me back a grade, you took the switch to me, but I was too numb for pain. Finally, you came in one morning and pulled me out of bed, but there was no switch in your hand. In your Macy's nightgown and your robe, you dropped and did push-ups on your hands and knees. I laughed and said, you do push-ups like a girl. In between your counts, you said, at least I can do them, Mr. Defensive Lineman who's still in bed. You're a boy on the Pee Wee football team whose mother does more push-ups than him. Wait till they hear. That was all you had to say. I was on the floor beside you and not on my knees. We did push-ups together, you and I. 20. Then we did sit-ups. Get the endorphins going, you huffed and puffed. Then you left to stuff my pea-stained sheets down the dirty clothes chute before my siblings woke up. After I washed and got dressed, you stooped and looked me in the eye. You're of good Louisiana stock and you have a strong mind. Tattoo. You're of good Louisiana stock and you have a strong mind. Quote for the day. You're of good Louisiana stock and you have a strong mind. Over Easter vacation, I finished 6 months of missing math and reading assignments, and I made it to 6th grade. Even in the Seattle summer of my discontent, you taught me. I became a writer by watching you earn your PhD and by memorizing those long, epic poems you made me memorize. You made me study them with flashcards the way you absorbed French and statistics. When you passed your qualifying exams and were ABD, all but dissertation, I asked you if you were finished. You smiled at me and said, no, it's only the beginning. The writing comes next. And after the writing, I asked you, after writing is the rewriting. I marveled at the way you hunkered down to write your dissertation. I watched you feed IMB punch cards into the mouths of Godzilla-sized computers that chewed raw data like cud. From ideas in your head to holes in your punch card, magic made into meaning, meaning molded into theses, theses typed onto pages, pages that became your black-bound book. You spun dross into gold. The next day they called you doctor, but to me you were a wizard. I asked you if I would ever write, and you told me yes, I would. I asked you what I should write about, and you told me to write what I know. So I wrote horror stories in which some of my teachers were unlucky, but they made you frown. Yet I might not have made it to the point where you would frown at my writing had I not knelt on the floor beside you with ashy legs in pea-stained pajamas. This love letter to his mama, definitely touches me because my mama is highly educated, smart woman, strong woman, fighter woman, very emotional. She's not perfect. She's no angel, but I definitely love my mama and very proud of her on everything she's accomplished. Anyway, As a child, I used to think life would be so much better in the year 2000. Flying cars, Dick Tracy watch phones, Ponce de Leon's Fountain of Youth boiled down into pills anyone could buy, and Kenwood would be buried in an archaeological dig. I never dreamed that Kenwood was everywhere, that you and I would still be animals when the new century was born. I was no Afro-pessimist when I was a child. My seminar on Lacan would start in 10 minutes. It was a half-hour bus ride to campus, and I had not moved. What's the use, Mom? Give me one good reason to get up off the floor. I shifted from my butt to my stomach. One push-up, Mom, I said inwardly. One's all you got. It was no use. My muscles didn't care. I glimpsed silos of dust beneath my bed. I knew what you would have said. How can you attain the good, the beautiful, and the true if your bedroom isn't clean? One push-up turned into 100. I even did some sit-ups. I went to the bathroom, juiced with just enough endorphins to open the medicine cabinet. There they were, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and chlorodiazepoxide, my two best friends in orange-brown bottles. I flushed them down the toilet. I was committing to make madness my refuge, to face the fact that my death makes the world a decent place to live, to embrace my objection and the antagonism that made me humanity's foil. I would make my home in the hold of the ship and burn it from the inside out. I washed my face and wore my school clothes and went to my class as a nightmare. Bars. All right. 9 years later, in 2009, I was tenured. I was a tenured professor at UC Irvine in Orange County, 400 miles down the coast. Alice and I lived in an ample, high-ceiling condo across the campus. I had just turned 53. The theatery fits and starts that had characterized my life's journey made me noticeably older than most professors at the rank of associate professor. In November, Alice would be 75. Yeah? What? Him and these old broad Frank, what are you doing? Frank, 73, my guy. Different strokes for different folks. In November, Alice would be 75. She'd retired from teaching up in Santa Cruz and moved to Orange County. We both were fond of saying we were in Orange County, but Orange County wasn't in us. Until moving to the Irvine Newport Beach area, I had seen only 2 Rolls Royces in my life. Now we live 4 miles from a Rolls Royce dealership, and we saw one at the mall, on the boulevards, at the gas pump, at the drive-up window of Starbucks, 3 to 4 times a month. Frequent sightings of $500,000 on wheels in the most banal and quotidian locations. The poverty line for the county was $80,000 a year. This wasn't Berkeley. Alice and I were slow to make friends. Up until the Race Rave conference in 2001, at UC Santa Cruz, when the white people in her group attacked her for insisting that they talk about themselves in terms of their common structural positions rather than in terms of their gendered identities or cultural heritage. Alice and I had not only embodied the antagonism between us, the irrevocable divide between the species, but we had performed it as well. Those were rough years in which love was laced with hate. During the 10 years before she retired, however, she had also begun to teach the works of Black radical thinkers, in particular the thinkers who, by 2009, would be associated with Afro-pessimism, and her intellectual commitment had spilled over into action. It was this willingness to throw her body against the institutions that had been the foundations of her entire life, as well as the glue that had held her most dear relations together, that unburdened our love affair of much of its inner turmoil and tension. Over the course of 2 years, she fought the anti-Black racists at 2 Santa Cruz colleges where we taught. Among them were her lifelong friends and her daughter, who taught at one of the colleges. Even though I love her, I hesitate to give her props for doing what she should have been doing before we even met. Why am I so chary with my praise and writing, when I am much more appreciative and not nearly as miserly at home? Because I fear the sense of relief a white reader might imbibe from such praise, the dewdrops of hope in a liberal's heart when they see a Black and white couple in love. There are indeed bonds of affection, often deep and profound, between a master and her slave, but that doesn't make it a relationship. Structurally, Structurally, there is no relationship between Black and human lovers, but nor is there an intra Black relationship, even though here too we often find bonds of deep, profound affection. A captive who marries his captor remains a captive. This was the brutal truth of what, for lack of another word, we called our love. Just as two captives who share the same bed under the roof of what, for lack of an honest word, they call their home are still captives. No captives to each other, but to a mesh of masters from their white neighbors to the FBI. In 1980, Stella and I learned this the hard way when we fled first our home and then the state of Minnesota. They say love conquers all makes us disavow a violence that has already conquered love. They say love conquers all makes us disavow a violence that has always already conquered love. Yeah, I think that's what he's saying here is that, essentially, romantic relationships between Black and white people can never truly be full human relationships. And I tend to agree with that, right? I mean, I'm in an interracial, international relationship. I'm Mexican, my wife is Jewish. And so in that situation, I'm always going to be, somewhat at a disadvantage because of the structural racism that we live around, in this white supremacist world. I can admit, or at least acknowledge, the premise that all Black people to all white people in this world are captives because we exist in their imagination, not as objects, not as other humans, but as objects. So yeah, I can agree with that in general. So there is no interracial redemption. There is no Afrocentric redemption. Redemption is the narrative inheritance of humans. There is no denouement to social death. But now Barack Obama had been sworn in 3 months prior, and there seemed few auditors for such an unflinching lens of analysis as Afro-pessimism in the academic circles Alice and I traveled in. At the campus yoga studio, one of Alice's white female friends, Henrietta, rejoiced at how wonderful and filled with hope the world was again. You and Frank must feel it, Henrietta said knowingly. Feel what? Alice asked. Alice knew exactly what Henrietta meant, that even though she, Alice, was well beyond childbearing age and therefore could not make her own little baby Obama, she and I had been sanctioned as a couple in the personage of the most powerful man in the world. Henrietta was nearly reduced to stammering by the discord in Alice's voice. Well, you know what I mean, Henrietta pleaded. No, what do you mean? Alice said. Then why on earth did you vote for Obama? The door to the yoga studio opened. Alice stood, gathered her bolster and her yoga mat. I didn't, she replied. Henrietta was apoplectic. You voted for McCain? I didn't vote, Henrietta. I stopped voting some time ago. If you knew more about this country, you'd stop voting too. There are other ways to fight for change. Rather than ask what those other ways were, Henrietta recoiled, as though Alice had said, I don't bathe. Henrietta, I stopped bathing long ago. If you knew more about hygiene, you'd stop bathing too. Later, Alice told me she'd never dismiss a Black person's investment in voting. Henrietta, however, was a different story. The election of the first Black president seemed to give my parents renewed vigor in the Cold War we'd fought since I was 12. Dad was 78. Mom was 77. They both were retired, and like Alice, who was 75, they had more time on their hands. This meant to my outer welcome and my inner dread, they came to California more often to visit my brother in Los Angeles and me and Alice 50 miles south on Coastal Highway 1. That's weird as hell to show up at your son's house and he is dating a woman that is old enough to be his mother. That's just wild, bro. That's wild. Anyway, we dined at El Fresco on a marble terrace with tall terracotta columns on a cliff overlooking the sea in Newport Beach. Mom's hair was well coiffed and perched with sunglasses, which gave her a cool, just back from Club Med for seniors look. Dad was better dressed than I had ever been when I worked as a stockbroker. Alice and I were dressed in solid black as though we had come not for lunch on a cliff above the sea, but to carry their bags. There were precious few guests on the terrace. It was spring, the summer season. Droves of tourists had yet to arrive. A squadron of double-crested cormorants laid siege to a boulder a mile out from the shore, and when the conversation lulled, one could hear the sound of suicide being practiced by waves on the rocks below. Soon the conversation ran aground as well. Alice and I had shown a little too much enthusiasm when we told them how high school students sometimes called us during the dinner hours to ask questions about Afro-pessimism. I think Mom was a bit incredulous at the idea that high school students were reading this material, but we explained that these students were high school debaters who read critical theory as part of their training. College debate coaches were also calling the House to ask questions and request Afro-pessimist seminars ever since a Black debate team from Towson University in Maryland beat Harvard in a national debate tournament. They did so, I explained, by refusing the question of the tournament rather than arguing pro or con within the logic of the question. It's unethical to insist the slave argue within the logic of a world that defines itself in opposition to them. So they interrogated the question's assumptive logic. Black students were mobilizing my claim that civil society was a murderous juggernaut of the slave, not a terrain of consent balanced by coercion, and mobilizing Saidiya Hartman's argument that the slave is the object or the ground that, by negation or contradistinction, defines liberty, citizenship, and the enclosure of the social body. My parents, especially my mother, were impressed by the social uplift narrative of Black students beating Harvard students in a game of wits. They were, however, underwhelmed by the strategies, and I suspect were inwardly alarmed that this was becoming a national trend. Alice chuckled. It's gotten to the point where white parents want to hire Frank to teach Afro-pessimism to their white children so that they can beat Black students in future tournaments. Some professors and debate coaches, I chimed in, want to impose a rule that would disqualify students who interrogate the question. We're witnessing the blackening of a major intercollegiate sport. Mom sighed. I don't see how Afro-pessimism can help these Black children become good citizens. What can it do to get Black people from point A to point B? She opined with a characteristic logic not in the least dulled by age. Out at sea, a large skiff of whale watchers skipped across the water, alarming the double-crested cormorants. They scattered like buckshot off the boulder. The main plates were cleared, and we ordered coffee and dessert. We were down to brass tacks, my mother and I. She said, what's the use of Afro-pessimism? What practical use does it have? I said, it's not a tractor. It can't mow your lawn. It's not what you mean, but it makes us worthy of our suffering. She said, how's suffering going to make me a good citizen? I said, I can't believe you're a Black psychologist who reads Fanon. She said, I read the funnies, but I don't quote the funnies. Oh, Mom. Oh, Mom. Okay, Mom. I said, don't patronize me. Dad tried to change the subject by noting how lush and green the headland looked. Alice said California had 7 growing seasons. They chewed that bit of trivia like cud. I told Mom that it was common for most people to feel like they'd been mugged by Afro-pessimism. It was a shrewd move on my part, for I knew how she hated to think of herself as a victim. That's why most people don't take the time to understand it, I said. They're too afraid. She scoffed. Afraid of what? Afraid of a problem in which everyone is complicit and for which no sentence can be written that would explain how to remedy it. Most people, Mom, even profound intellectuals like you and Dad and Alice and myself, and if I'm to be honest, are emotionally unable to wallow in a problem that has no solution. Black suffering is that problem. And a suffering without a solution is a hard thing to hold, especially if that suffering fuels the psychic health of the rest of the world. But that's what it means to be a slave, to be the host of that parasite called the human. Mom rejoined that she wasn't anybody's slave, and that even when our ancestors were slaves, they were human beings. Being human isn't anything to aspire to, I said. Just ask Alice. Though we all laughed, the laughter was uneasy. This was the elephant in the room. My marriage to Alice, her presence in place in what the conversation implied. No one asked me to defend the thinly veiled claim that Alice was both my wife and my master, but everyone, including me, especially me, flinched when I told that joke. We all knew what I meant. We were all academics, and that's how the conversation was supposed to stay. Academic. If we were going to have it all, say what you want, but don't bring it home. I had broken that unspoken rule, but it got their attention, and Obama had not been shot by them across the bow. Even Every time Alice spoke, I witnessed a slight delay of comprehension in my mother's eyes, like someone paused at a green light, as though Alice's words were chasing the faces they went with. Faces my mother had seen years before in Kenwood. The countenances of white women Alice surely conjured when she spoke. A sonic boom of faces from the past. All the masters in the world, Mom must have thought, rolled into my son's wife as he drones on about our suffering. Martin Luther King was killed a year after Selena Davenport wounded Mom by wounding me, and in the same year, the white housewives of Mom and Dad's fair housing workshops shut her down and exiled her to the marble foyer of a mansion. 6 days after King was gunned down, Mom made me and my sister trudge through the slush of a winter-touched spring and stuff those women's mailboxes with an open letter she had written. Here in Kenwood, a sharp struggle for better human relations for our community and city, Mom wrote, have been raging during the past few months. If you haven't heard about it or haven't been called by someone, pro or con, just ask your neighbor. The most vicious aspect of this struggle is not that one plan or another has been considered or not considered, but that the minds of so many are closed, so obstructive to anything which challenges or trends to alter the uniqueness of Kenwood, whatever that is. That there are only 2 Black homeowners in Kenwood, and that these purchases were made in spite of deliberate impediments and undue difficulty is a fact. Is this the uniqueness of Kenwood? Perhaps I was channeling the memory of that day we mailed her letter, when we all ate lunch by the sea. It helped me understand why Mom seemed so tense and withdrew when Alice spoke. Alice wasn't one of the women from her past, but structurally she was. This made Mom an Afro-pessimist par excellence, but to show it, she'd have to bring it home. A few weeks before my parents came out to California, a young Black woman came to my office hours and said she wanted to drop my class. She said she was having difficulty with the reading material and the effort was taking too much of a toll on her. I couldn't fathom this, since her midterm exam and her paper demonstrated mastery, an unfortunate word, of the material. She understood critical theory at levels exemplary of the most advanced graduate students, and she was still a senior in college. I told her that the thing that prevented most students from getting their heads around Afro-pessimism was the fact that it described a structural problem but offered no structural solution to that problem. To suffer like a white woman or Native Americans or post-colonial subjects would have been heaven for us, because the suffering of the slave would have human resonance, and that human resonance would lend itself to very human answers to the question, what is to be done? Or what does freedom look like? What could launch coherent liberation campaigns? However, that would be disastrous for the human race. This is why Afro-pessimism has no prescriptive gesture, because the end of our suffering signals the end of the human, the end of the world. But you know all of this, I assured her. You should be holding office hours for me. It's not that I don't understand, she said. This class has turned my head around. It's explained things that I only saw before in my peripheral vision. Then what's the problem, I asked. It hurts, she said. It hurts so bad. She began to cry, first softly, then like an uncontrollable torrent. I told her that I had forgotten. No, I corrected myself. I had repressed how much it hurts. This made her laugh. I was glad to see her smile, but I didn't think what I said was funny. I don't believe you, she said. You teach with such composure and your voice never cracks. And here I am bawling in your office. You might not believe this, I confided, but only 9 years ago, I had a nervous breakdown when I was a graduate student. It was a doozy, snot all dripping down my mouth, mixed with tears. I was a show enough embarrassment to the race. She was shaking her head and laughing now, as though watching an act on the Chitlin circuit. Lord have mercy. There were mornings when I rolled out of bed onto the floor and ate balls of dust for breakfast. I could stay there for hours. That's how broke down I was. She laughed again and said I was lying. It was good to see her come out of her funk. I kid you not, I was a slobbering fool, a graduate student in his 40s. We'd fought a revolution in his 30s. A graduate student in his 40s who'd fought a revolution in his 30s. The stakes, the implications of what it all meant for the dissertation I was writing, what it meant for Black life, I'm telling you. Uppers and downers were my 2 best friends. And my wife is white, you dig? Afro-pessimism ain't exactly an aphrodisiac in an interracial love affair. Hey, baby, how about we smoke a little structural antagonism before we make love? Shoot, it's a wonder I ain't cross-eyed. She grinned ear to ear and said it seemed strange to laugh at her professor. Then she asked if she could tell me something personal. I nodded. She said that her father was black and her mother was white, and she added that her boyfriend was Asian American. My mom is a master of my father and of me, and so is my boyfriend, she went on. I can see it clearly now in the symptoms of our relationships. Professor, it hurts. It hurts so bad because I also see things in me that I've repressed. The way I love my mom but hate her so much. The way I love my boyfriend and hate him as well. I hate them not for what they do, because they're both loving and sweet. I hate them because of what they can do, and they don't want to talk about it. Human capacity, I nodded. It's your mother's inheritance, but she can't pass it on to either you or your father. And you and your Asian partner have kids. They will follow your lack and not his plentitude. It's a lot to take in. It seems that I've loved them and hated them forever, she said. I told her that my first book was about this very problem, a duel in the heart for which no denouement is possible. So was adamant, however, about dropping the class. She was adamant, however, about dropping the class because it was too painful to discuss social death and Black suffering in a multiracial classroom. It was then I realized what needed to be adjusted in the way I presented the material in class. The spotlight has been too much on us, I admitted, and not enough on them. How they are who they are because who, sorry, how they are who they are because we are who they have made us, how anti-Blackness reproduces as human beings. So I made her a deal. For the rest of the quarter, I would focus on how the human functions and thrives as the parasite of the slave. We would do a closed reading on how human capacities are manifest in specific genders and cultures. The course needed balance. I would explain, not merely assert, how and why the human is unethical, whether she is communist and a feminist, whether he is a fascist and a misogynist. They are all embodiments of capacity, and capacity is an offense. I asked her if she would give me 2 weeks of teaching to make good on my promise. She was laughing again. Now, what's so funny? The non-Black students will complain and the administration will fire you. Would admin fire a non-Black professor if the Black student union complained? I asked. She shook her head. Then to hell with the administration. You're risking your sanity to stay with me for 2 more weeks. The least I can do is risk my job. Now that's teaching right there. And this is like, I think, that's a new perspective you can put on the Afro-pessimism thing, because the way Frank frames it, right? There's humans at the top and then there's slaves or Blacks at the bottom, right? And the human festers on the slave or Black at the bottom, right? And of course creates all sorts of structures to keep that parasitic relationship in play. But I think you could also flip that on its head, because I think you would have to have a tad bit of like NOI 5%er like type of Black supremacy in play. Because if like you believe, for example, like I used to be a 5%er. I'm gonna show my tattoo for a bit, right? Used to be a 5%er. But if you have like in your ideology built in the Black man is God, for example, right? And we're living like how the Hebrew Israelites say in an upside down world right now, where the sons of Esau are now controlling the show, right? But we're really the actual Hebrews, or we're the real, humans that exist on earth. You could have an Afro-pessimist point of view that says the actual humans have been made slaves, and the people that should be slaves are pretending to be humans. Like we're living in this sort of like doppelganger world, if that makes sense. That could be another way of, if the Afro-pessimism that Frank puts out is too dark, if it's too troubling, if it's too nihilistic, if it's too depressing to have, I think you would have to make it essential in the worldview to say that inherently race is not real, but people of sub-Saharan African descent are the original humans on the earth. We have the dominant genes, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, we are truly the ones who should be in power, or if not in power, treated as the most human, because we have the oldest lineage on the planet. We are the first humans. But we're living in this upside down world where, the parasitic non-humans are creating a false reality of humanity based on our existence. I think that could be another way of looking at it. In fact, that's sort of like my worldview. I wouldn't say I'm a Black supremacist to that degree, But I've always said that yeah, the first Jews were black, right? Like, civilization was built in Africa by black skinned people. Like, looking at a black man's face, you're looking at the face of God. These are quotes and ideas, templates for my ideology I still believe in, right? So I think that's what's preventing me from saying, oh, I'm an Afro-pessimist. I'm a full-on Afro-pessimist. I believe in black realism. I hate the term Afro, number one. I've said this before in my Afro-pessimism video, but I'm going to do my full breakdown as we end this book because we're almost at the end right here. But anyway, that just came to my mind right here. But anyway, I'm going to continue. So it was going on 3, and my parents needed to drive up the coast to my brother's house in Los Angeles ahead of the afternoon traffic. I paid the bill, and the 4 of us, Alice, Mom, and Dad, and me, filed out of the open-air dining terrace and made our way through the enclosed part of the establishment to where their driver was waiting for them. Alice and Dad led the way, speaking amicably. Mom and I trailed in silence. Then she stopped. She let them sift away from us. Now her hand was on my heart. I want to manage your time better, she said. Defensiveness coursed through my veins. Just leave me alone. I braced myself for one of her criticisms. When my first book came out, she wrote me to say, with degrees from Dartmouth, Columbia, and UC Berkeley, you could have been president like Obama, but you had to do this. Why can't you put your talents to use in a way that contributes to America's reform instead of tearing it down all the time? I'd heard this since I was 12. It looped in my brain like music in an elevator stuck between floors. Just go to LA and see my brother. He's a good citizen. I could tell from our conversation at the table, she said, that you have 2 more books in you. Don't take on undue administrative responsibilities, and every class you teach doesn't have to be perfect. Manage your time so you can write those books. You've got a good head on your shoulders. I laughed, not at her, but in relief. Of all the things she could have said, this was the most unexpected. Why are you laughing? You're of good Louisiana stock and you have a strong mind. Well, that too. I'm still doing push-ups. Push-ups? Never mind. We were both smiling. Dad and Alice are waiting. Write those books, you hear. She patted my chest again. I'm proud of you, son. I love you. They say that the flutter of a butterfly's wings can trigger a monsoon somewhere else in the world. That's what happened when she touched my heart and said what she said. 40 years of strike and counterstrike, a war of attrition we'd fought since she'd saved Reg's life in that Seattle parking lot had ended. I told her I was proud of her too, and I said I loved her. For the next 10 years, we each made an effort to say these things to each other. I praised her for her leadership roles in sororities and social clubs, even Jack and Jill, and in religious order, I had heretofore been disdainful of. I praised her for all the people's lives she had healed in the private psychology practice she and Dad maintained. I even told her I was proud of what a good citizen she was. I said it like I meant it, and I really did. And for her part, she kept encouraging me to write without lambasting my politics. We always parted, whether on the phone or on our rare face-to-face encounters, with the words, I love you. We had 10 good years before her stroke, her heart failure, her dementia. That is, before she lost my name and died. The last time I saw her, she was sitting in the memory unit, the lockdown ward of a nursing home. A polite but no-nonsense German-looking woman called her Miss Ida as she straightened the bedclothes and watered a plant I had sent her. Mom cast a raised eyebrow of caution my way and whispered, we call her Il Duce. The woman heard this, and I realized from Mom's smug demeanor that she was meant to. I apologized profusely on Mom's behalf and found out that her name was really Angela. Miss Ida, you're a hoot. Owl's hoot, Mom said flatly, adding, you should show less cleavage. Who are your people? Oh, God, that's funny. Okay. Angela said she wasn't leaving until Mom ate some of the food she hadn't even touched. Fascism is alive and well, Mom observed. My mother's arms, wrists, and hands made me think of prisoners in a concentration camp. Her dexterity was no match for the simple tasks of holding her utensils. I offered to help her, but Angela said that, difficult as it may be, she could do it, and she did it yesterday, and that she had to get her strength back. The fork fell to the floor. Mom pushed her plate away. I told her, she said, as though speaking to herself, I'm not interested in food. Then she asked me if I had just come from the Washington Monument. When I said no, we're in Minneapolis, not in DC. She said I never did have a sense of direction. No wonder. I'd come late for my sister's recital. What recital? I wanted to know. Where? Angela's two-way radio called her to an emergency, and she left. When Angela was out of earshot, Mom said she was sure Angela was tapping her phone. I didn't argue, but asked where the recital was. What do you mean, where? The Jack and Jill convention? Down the hall in the ballroom, silly? She asked me when my father and Dr. Johnson, a longtime psychology colleague of theirs, were returning from wherever they went. I wanted to remind her that Dad was in a nursing home on the other side of town, but she held up her index finger. Listen, your sister plays beautifully. The Jack and Jill convention must have been in 1970, and my sister had not played the piano for almost 40 years. But I sat with Mom and listened until the end of the concerto, or was it an etude? Then came an ice age of silence in which she said nothing and seemed not to notice I was there. Snowplows groaned in the street below her windows. The branches of trees were bare and starred with frost. Where was the woman who danced slowly in her stocking feet with my father in the living room at night? Johnny Hartman on the hi-fi and not a worry in the world. The woman who said my stock was good and my mind was strong. Where was she? The woman who made me want to write. Her hair was as white and thin as dandelion puffs, but there was a natural beauty to it that I had not seen when I was a child, and she used to press it. Then Lizard used to press it. Then lizard tracks lined her face down thin. Lizard tracks lined her face drawn thin as her wrist, thin as the last rail of garden sculpture. She was humming now. She had not spoken for a while. Then, as if she'd been reading my mail, she sat up straight as a washboard. Her bony hand seized the arms of her wheelchair. Like Harriet Tubman staring down a gun barrel, she looked at me. Didn't I tell you, boy, people have to die? I know I told you that. Then she fell back into her eyes. I went into the hallway so she wouldn't see me cry. When I returned to the room, she asked me who I was. Though dementia, Alzheimer's, all that's so scary. That's hella scary, man. Horrible way to die. Anyway, we're almost wrapping it up here. Yeah, we got two more pages. Let's go. So, she died in a polar vortex. It was 49 degrees below zero in Minneapolis. Pyramids of snow mobbed the margins of the highway from the airport to the funeral home. The wind swept torrents of snow off the mounds along the highway. I saw it coming, but it was too late. I was driving too fast. It rose in a cyclone and dropped suddenly, a massive white wall erected over the highway. It made anything more than a foot in front of me impossible to see. The rental car plunged into this white wall at 65 miles an hour. The car skidded and hydroplaned as I frantically pumped the brakes. Would I kill or be killed as I rammed another car from behind? I wondered. There are no atheists in foxholes, Mom used to say. For an instant, she was right. Then, without warning, it lifted. The road was clear for miles, and I was still alive. It was 43 and the sun had set. I had 15 minutes to get to the funeral home, but I had to slow down. The viewing rooms at the funeral home were closed for the night, but the mortician was kind enough to roll her body into a utility room. The hallways were adorned with pictures of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. This was Esther's funeral chapel on the north side of town. She did not want to be buried in Kenwood. For a long time, my knees wouldn't take me to the side of the room where she lay. I just sat inside the room, sobbing, begging her to wake up. You can't die, I told her. I asked her how she could leave me without saying goodbye. Why didn't she wait for me? The mortician was a brother, 30 years my junior, but he led me over to her body like I was a baby learning to walk. I kissed her hard, cold cheek. I begged her to wake up until I was hoarse. I told her I would be the good citizen she always wanted me to be. I would do anything she ever wanted me to do. At a gathering of family and friends that took place after her funeral, I told the story of what she did when she walked out of the restaurant on the precipice in California, how she placed her hand on my heart and said she was proud of me, how that changed our relationship in a way that I could never have imagined possible, how we said I love you to each other for the first time in 40 years. Then I read a poem I had written for her. Civil rights. Mother never spoke of slavery, not New Orleans doctors who cut without pain, killers, the private of female slaves in their Mad Hatter quest to cure incontinence, not the lash of whips upriver. But when they killed Dr. Martin Luther King, she wrote every blue hair, blonde-eyed a letter. Like any spring of no reply, winter was late in leaving, and we were her only postage. My sister and I walking end to end through the sleep of slush and the push of wind, No one dabbed a crystalled eye, for she would have no crying. Mm. On the way to the airport from my flight back home, I don't know why, but I bought a blank card. It lay open on on my tray table for the entire flight. I didn't know what to write. Who buys a greeting card for the dead? The Newport Beach coast, where we had dined al fresco, was coming into view. I looked down at the card. It was wet with tears. Now the flight attendant told me again to stow my tray table. As the plane surrendered to the pull of the earth, I wrote what time allowed. Dear Mom, I don't know if you're in heaven with Jesus or sailing the cosmos with Shango, or if your soul has gone to rest in the consummate hands of gifted musicians. But wherever you are, please wait for me, that we might spend eternity as we spent the last 10 years. I miss you so much. With all my love, your son, Frank. Bremen Hudson Irvine, 2014 to 2019. And that's the end of the book. So this was a very interesting book, man. I really loved it. Really loved it. By closing talking about his mother's death, I think, throughout the text, he's constantly making this point that Black people are essentially, non-human, right? But the death of your mother, the death of a parent, is one of those traumatic events that all of us will face as humans if we're lucky enough to have known our biological parents, right? And so when he's talking about Black people are not human, he is not saying that we're not human, if that makes sense. I think we have to take this more abstractly. Human in the sense that Black people are not human in the sense that we're not guaranteed all the rights and privileges and respect and due service that all humans demand or are required to have, right? So human as a construct is not what Black people are, but human in the sense of course, being biologically real humans who can think, feel, take a shit, take a piss, have sex, etc. Right? We're human in that sense, and we're also human in the sense that we have full range of emotions. But the human that Black people are not is the construct that we have in our mind of what a human is capable of doing and what a human deserves to have, which is what we are not. So there's the abstract capital H human, I guess, and then there's the lowercase human that we are. And so by talking about his mother's death, he's sort of, I feel like, reminding us that, hey, we might not be capital H human, but we are lowercase human, in the sense that I cry when my mother dies. I fear for my own mortality. I reminisce on the past and what could have been, and have regrets, have loved. I think, this book, for being such a tough concept to grasp, he goes through a full human experience in it, through childhood, through coming of age, through wild romances, to wandering in his 20s and 30s, to coming to full realization, to having a mental breakdown, and then, seeing his mother pass, being the end of an era. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's all sort of like very human. This is a very human, anti-human book, if that makes sense. And one of the most profound books I've ever read. Really loved it. I give this book a 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10. It's not a perfect book. Some parts in here could have been clipped and snipped. Like, there were parts in chapter 3 that were a bit silly, like him jotting every single moment that he was running around Minneapolis with Stella in their minivan. Like, that was a bit silly. But overall, this is a great book. You should read it. I wouldn't mind reading it again, maybe in 2 or 3 years from now. And shout out to Frank P. Wilderson. Shout out to everybody who tuned into this series. If you watched it live, or you will watch it on the playback. And once again, this is Booked React. Booked React 7. I don't think we'll be able to reach 10 this year like I thought I would. But at least we made progress, and at least we read something, because there's a lot of people every year who do not even finish one book, never even pick it up. But we did 7 this year, so that's a good thing. You know what I mean? That's at least one every 2 months. And next year, we're going to work it up to 1 every month. And then after that, 2 every month, until eventually we're reading all the time, challenging ourselves with text all the time, and doing writing ourselves as well. So my name is Simon Hill. I'm from Louisiana. I'm of good Louisiana stock, and I have a sound mind, and I hope you are too.